I learned to trust my shield before I ever learned to trust my courage. The courage could fail, a flickering candle in the gale force winds of fear. But the shield, a heavy plank of stormwind oak banded with true silver steel, was a simple and honest thing. It would hold or it would break. There was no deceit in it. I was a footman in the king's service, a son of Elwyn, and my world had shrunk to the weight on my left arm and the biting cold of this forsaken continent. Here in Northrend, at Valiant's Keep, honesty was a rare commodity, and a simple truth like a good shield was worth more than a king's ransom. My post was the western battlement, overlooking the gray, churning waters of the Borean tundra's coast. The days bled into one another, marked only by the changing of the guard and the thickness of the frost on the stone. Routine was our armor against the creeping dread that seeped from the land itself. At dawn, the horn would sound, a mournful cry that the wind seemed to mock. I would rise from my cot, the air of physical pain in my lungs, and begin the ritual. First, the leather gambeson, its familiar scent of wax and sweat a small comfort. Then the mail, each ring a cold kiss against the wool. Finally, the plate, greaves, gauntlets, cuirass, strapped and buckled in a sequence I could perform in total darkness. The final piece was the lion-crested helm of Stormwind, its gaze fixed forward, unblinking. It hid my face, and in doing so, made me part of the wall. The keep was a city of grim purpose. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer was its heartbeat, a constant, rhythmic reassurance that we were still mending, still fighting. Priests from the Cathedral of Light held services in a makeshift chapel, their gentle chants a fragile bastion against the profound, unholy silence that lay beyond our walls. I would sometimes stand at the back, not for the sermons, but for the warmth of the candles and the sight of the light's grace made manifest in their spells. It felt distant to me, a language I once understood but had started to forget. My faith was in the man standing next to me in the shield wall, in the keen edge of my blade, and in the sergeant's parade ground bellow that could cut through the fog of battle. Sergeant Boren was a man carved from granite and stubbornness. His face was a roadmap of old wars. A jagged scar through one eyebrow from a troll spear and stranglethorn, a pockmark on his cheek from an orc's axe in the Second War. He had seen it all, and his eyes held the weary patience of a man who expected the worst and was rarely disappointed. He taught us the things that kept you alive, things not found in the infantry manuals. How to read the wind for the scent of decay that heralded the Scourge. How to plant your feet on icy ground so a ghoul's charge wouldn't send you sprawling. How to listen, in the dead of night, for the sound of bones scraping on stone. Fear is a tool, he would rasp, his voice like gravel grinding together. Let the enemy have it. You hold the line. That's all you do. You hold the line. Our squad was a microcosm of the Alliance itself. There was Thurger Bronzebeard, a dwarf from Ironforge whose ancestral axe had a name I couldn't pronounce and a history he was all too willing to share over a pint of ale. He was our anchor, his short, powerful frame seemingly immovable. Then there was Alara, a young priestess barely out of her novitiate in Northshire Abbey. Her faith was a brilliant, burning thing, fierce and untempered by the long years of doubt that plagued the older chaplains. She saw the light not as a gentle comfort, but as a righteous fire to scourge the darkness. When she called upon it, her eyes would blaze, and for a moment, the chill of this land would recede. We watched over her, and she, in turn, watched over our souls and our flesh, mending both with her prayers. The quiet moments were the most dangerous. In the clamor of the training yard or the mess hall, you were just another soldier. But alone, on watch, with the wind whispering its secrets from the direction of ice ground, the mind could wander. I would think of the rolling green hills of Elwyn, the warmth of the sun on the vineyards of my home. I remembered the taste of fresh-baked bread from the Lion's Pride Inn, the sound of children laughing in the streets of Goldshire. These memories were a lifeline, but they were also a torment. They reminded me of what we fought for, but also of everything we stood to lose, everything this land of death sought to erase. The Lich King's greatest weapon wasn't his armies of undead. It was the slow, grinding despair that eroded a man from the inside out. He didn't just want your life. He wanted your hope. One evening, during the long, blue twilight that passed for dusk in this season, Thurger was polishing the intricate runes on his axe by the light of a brazier. The firelight danced across his braided beard, catching the silver clasps. He hummed a low, guttural tune, a song of stone and deep places. "You're quiet tonight, lad," he rumbled, not looking up from his work. Quieter than usual, I was leaning against the Merlin, my gaze lost in the shimmering curtain of lights that danced in the northern sky. They were beautiful, but they felt like a beautiful shroud over a corpse. "Just thinking," I said, "about what the sergeant said, about holding the line." Thurger grunted, testing the axe's edge with a callous thumb. "Good advice. The line is everything. It's the shield next to yours. It's the priestess behind you. It's the knowledge that you're not standing alone in the dark. Break the line, and the dark gets in." He finally looked at me, his eyes dark and ancient. "Let me tell you something my father told me. A dwarf is his oath. A man is his word. Here, our oath and our word are the same. We held. That was the beginning and the end of our duty. We held the walls of Valiant's Keep. We held the supply routes from the coast. We held our nerve when the shambling horrors came out of the mists. We held onto the memories of home, shielding them like a flame in a storm. But we all knew, in the unspoken depths of our hearts, that we were not here to win. We were here to endure. We were a dam of flesh and steel against an ocean of death, and every day, we could feel the pressure mounting. The cracks were beginning to show. A scout party would go missing. A patrol would return with fewer men, their eyes wide with things they could not or would not describe. The air itself was growing colder, heavier, charged with a malevolent will that pressed down on our spirits. The routines, the rituals, the camaraderie, they were all we had to keep that pressure from crushing us completely. The summons came not with a grand trumpet blast, but with the quiet, urgent step of a runner from the command bastion. It was late, the third watch of the night, and a false quiet had settled over the keep. I was on duty with Borin, pacing the ramparts, our breath pluming in the frigid air. The runner, a young squire with a face pale from more than just the cold, saluted sharply. "Sergeant Borin, the commander requires your presence. Immediately. Your squad is to be placed on alert." Borin's expression didn't change, but a new tension entered his posture. He nodded once. Understood. He turned to me. "Kalen, rouse the others. Full battle kit. Meet at the north gate in 20 minutes. No noise." He didn't need to say it. The urgency was a palpable thing, a dissonant note in the keep's nightly rhythm. Something was wrong. I moved through the barracks like a ghost. Thurger was already awake, sitting on the edge of his cot, his axe resting across his knees as if he had been expecting the call. He simply nodded as I passed. Alara was in the chapel, kneeling before the altar. She looked up as I entered, her face serene, but her hands were clenched tight around the silver symbol of the light she wore. "The light calls us to service," she said, her voice a low, steady whisper. It wasn't a question. I just nodded and left her to her prayers. By the time I had my own gear fully secured, the others were already gathering, shadows moving in the deeper shadows of the gatehouse. There was no chatter, no nervous banter. We each performed our own silent rituals, checking straps, tightening buckles, whispering a prayer or an oath to whatever we held sacred. Commander Halford stood before us in the lee of the gate, a map spread on a crate before him, illuminated by a single hooded lantern. His face was grim, etched with the weariness of a man who sent others to die for a living. At ease, he began, his voice low but carrying in the still air. 3 hours ago, we lost contact with the Farsher mine. It's a small iron deposit, but it's vital for our smiths. A patrol sent to investigate has not returned. He tapped a location on the map, a point deep in the woods that bordered the tundra. Aerial reconnaissance spotted this. He moved the lantern, and the light fell on a grainy, magical image. It was a structure, angular and jagged, pulsing with a faint, sickly green light. It hadn't been there yesterday. A necropolis, sprung up like a black mushroom overnight. It's sitting right on top of the mine's location, a cold dread sharper than the wind, settled over me. A necropolis. Not just a roaming band of ghouls, but a fortress of the Scourge, a factory for their unholy war machine. Boren spoke, his voice flat. "Our orders, Commander." Halford looked at each of us in turn, his gaze lingering for a moment. "This is not a siege. I don't have the forces to spare for a full assault. This is a surgical strike. Your squad will infiltrate the area, ascertain the strength of the enemy, and if possible, disrupt whatever ritual they are performing. We believe they are using the miners and our missing patrol to fuel it." The unspoken words hung in the air. The miners were gone. The patrol was gone. This was not a rescue mission. "The light guides us," Ilaris said softly, her hand on her holy symbol. Thurger spat on the ground. "And a sharp axe helps," Halford rolled up the map. "You are our eyes and ears, Sergeant. Your objective is intelligence and disruption. Do not engage the main force unless absolutely necessary. Get in, do what you can, and get out. The lives of your people are worth more than a pile of rocks." It was the closest the commander ever came to sentimentality. He looked at Boren. "Any questions?" Boren shook his head. "None, sir." "Then go with the light," Halford said, turning away and melting back into the darkness. His dismissal was as abrupt as his summons. We were alone again, a small squad of 4, facing a fortress of the damned. Boren turned to us, his face half in shadow. "You heard the man. Swift and silent. We move in 5 minutes. Check your gear one last time." He walked over to me, clapping a heavy gauntlet on my shoulder. "Kalen, you're on point with me. Your eyes are sharp. I want you watching for tracks, for disturbed snow, for anything out of place. This is their ground now. We are the intruders." I nodded, my throat too dry for words. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. This was different. This wasn't holding a wall. This was stepping into the heart of the enemy's power. Thurger came to stand beside me, his shield already strapped to his arm. "Don't you worry, lad. We've faced worse." I looked at his bearded, resolute face and tried to believe him. I wasn't sure we had. We gathered in a tight circle, just before the gate was winched open. Ilaris stepped into the center. A moment, she whispered. She raised her hands, palms open. "May the light be a lantern to your path, a shield for your heart, and a sword for your hand. May it grant you clarity in the darkness, and courage in the face of despair." A soft, golden light bloomed from her hands, washing over us. It was warm, a stark contrast to the biting cold. It didn't banish the fear, but it gave it form, something to push against. It was a reminder that we were not of this place, that we carried a fire the darkness could not extinguish. I felt the warmth sink into my armor, into my bones. For the Alliance, for the King, for the memory of sunlight. The gate groaned open, a dark mouth revealing a world of white and gray. We stepped through, and the gate closed behind us with a final, echoing thud. We were outside the walls. We were in the wild. The march was a lesson in silence and cold. We moved through the skeletal remains of a forest that clawed at the edge of the tundra, its blackened, leafless branches like skeletal fingers reaching for a gray, unforgiving sky. The snow underfoot was deep and soft, muffling our steps but draining our strength with every stride. Boren led the way, his movements economical and sure, a hunter in his element. I followed a few paces behind, and to his left, my shield held high to deflect any sudden ambush, my eyes scanning every shadow, every drift of snow. My senses felt heightened raw. The snap of a frozen twig under Thurger's heavy boot sounded like a thunderclap. The whisper of the wind through the dead trees sounded like voices, mocking and indistinct. Every so often, Boren would hold up a fist, and we would freeze, melting into the shadows of the trees. We would wait, listening, our breath held tight in our chests. The silence of Northrend was not an absence of sound. It was a presence. It was the weight of ages, the pressure of a billion souls silenced before their time. It was a hungry, listening quiet, and I felt as though we were trespassing in a vast, open tomb. More than once, I felt a prickling at the back of my neck, the distinct, unnerving sensation of being watched by something unseen, something ancient, and utterly without pity. I would scan the trees, the ridges, but see nothing. It was a pressure on the mind, a subtle poison. The Lich King's domain began long before you saw the first ghoul. It began with the doubt he planted in your heart. After what felt like an eternity, we found the first sign of the missing patrol. A discarded ration pack, half buried in the snow. A few yards further, a single steel gauntlet, its fingers curled as if still trying to grip a sword. There were tracks, a chaotic mess of heavy boot prints, and something else. Something that didn't use boots. Long, dragging furrows in the snow, interspersed with the clawed prints of something heavy. Ghoul tracks. Boren knelt, examining the scene. He ran a gloved finger over the edge of one of the boot prints. They were ambushed here, he said, his voice a low growl. They put up a fight. A short 1 inch he pointed. The tracks lead northeast. All of them. The Scourge and our people, they hadn't just been killed. They had been taken. We followed the trail with renewed caution. The feeling of being watched intensified, and now it had a focus. It was coming from ahead, a psychic hum that vibrated just at the edge of hearing. It made my teeth ache and the old scar on my shoulder throb with a phantom pain. Alara walked with one hand resting on the hilt of her mace, her lips moving in a silent prayer. Even Thurgar, usually a bastion of stoic resolve, seemed unsettled, his grip on his axe tight enough to turn his knuckles white. The land itself was changing. The snow grew thinner, revealing cracked, black earth beneath, as if the ground itself was blighted. The air grew thick with a faint, cloying stench, the smell of old meat and arcane corruption. The first clash came without warning. We were moving through a narrow defile, flanked by high, rocky walls, when they rose from the snow. One moment, we were walking on an unbroken field of white. The next, a dozen figures clawed their way out of the ground, their movements jerky and unnatural. Ghouls. Their skin was the color of old parchment stretched tight over warped bones. Their eyes were points of cold, blue light, burning with a mindless hunger. They let out a chorus of high-pitched, chittering shrieks that scraped at the nerves. Boren's command was instantaneous, a sharp, explosive roar. Shield wall. Now! There was no time for thought, only instinct honed by endless drills. Thurgar, Boren, and I slammed our shields together, the sound of steel on steel a defiant clang in the sudden chaos. I planted my feet, leaning into the shield, its familiar weight a comfort. The first ghoul hit my shield with a wet, meaty thud that jarred my arm to the shoulder. Its claws scraped down the metal, seeking a purchase. I could smell its grave stench, see the madness in its glowing eyes through the vision slit of my helm. I thrust my sword over the top of the shield, a short, sharp jab into its throat. It made a gurgling sound and fell back, but another was already there to take its place. For Iron Forge, Thurgar bellowed, his voice a force of nature. His axe rose and fell in a glittering arc, cleaving a ghoul from shoulder to hip. The spray of black, viscous fluid that erupted from the creature spattered against his armor. Boren was a model of deadly efficiency, his movements precise and lethal. Shield bash, sword thrust, step repeat. He fought not with rage, but with a cold, methodical focus, a butcher at his work. Behind us, Alara was our light in the darkness. "Let the light sear you, abominations!" she cried, and a wave of holy fire erupted from her outstretched hands, engulfing 3 of the creatures. They shrieked, a sound of pure agony, as the golden flames consumed them, leaving behind only piles of scorched bone and ash. But they kept coming. For every one we cut down, another seemed to scramble over its fallen comrade. They were relentless, driven by a will that was not their own. They felt no pain, no fear. They were merely weapons, animated flesh directed by a distant, malevolent intelligence. I felt a blow against the side of my helm that sent my head ringing, and I staggered back a step, breaking the integrity of the wall. A ghoul with half a face lunged into the gap, its claws reaching for me. Before I could recover, Thurgar slammed his shield into its side, crushing it against the rock wall. "Watch your footing, lad," he roared. I gritted my teeth, shook my head to clear the ringing, and drove my shield forward, reclaiming my place in the line. The fight was a blur of steel, snarls, and the blinding flash of Alera's spells. It was brutal, intimate work. The reek of death was overpowering. I learned that the Scourge did not bleed red. They leaked a black, ichorous fluid that steamed where it touched the snow. I learned that the light in their eyes was not a soul, but a cage, a spark of necromantic energy that animated the dead meat around it. We were not fighting soldiers. We were fighting puppets, and the puppeteer was watching, testing our defenses, learning our strengths. The thought sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Suddenly, from the rocks above, a new threat emerged. Skeletal mages, their bones held together by crackling blue energy. They raised their hands, and bolts of frost shot towards us. One struck the ground at Alera's feet, and the snow flash froze into a prison of jagged ice, trapping her. "Alera!" Borin yelled. He broke from the wall, charging towards a trapped priestess, his shield raised. "Thurgar with me. Kalen, hold the line." It was the one command I dreaded, to be the single point of defense. The ghouls, sensing a weakness, surged towards me. I braced myself, my shield my only world, the snarling faces of the dead the only thing in it. I was no hero. I was a footman from Elwyn. But Thurgar's words came back to me. "The line is everything." I roared, a sound of desperation and fury, and met the charge. I was no longer fighting with skill, but with pure animal instinct. Block, parry, stab. My arm screamed with effort, my breath coming in ragged, burning gasps. A claw raked across my visor, the screech of metal on metal deafening. Another tore my grief. I was being overwhelmed, pushed back step by agonizing step. And then I heard Thurgar's war cry. He and Borin had shattered Alera's icy prison and were now cutting their way back to me. Alera, freed, unleashed a wave of divine power that staggered the ghouls, giving me a moment's respite. The tide turned. With the four of us reunited, the mindless assault of the ghouls faltered. We pressed our advantage, fighting back-to-back in a circle of steel and holy light. Thurgar's axe was a whirlwind of destruction. Borin was the unyielding rock against which the wave of bodies broke. Alera's light was both our salvation and our wrath. I found my rhythm again, moving in concert with them, a part of a single, living weapon. In minutes that felt like hours, it was over. The last ghoul fell, its head severed by a final, vicious swing from Borin. The silence that descended was more jarring than the noise of battle. All that remained was the whisper of the wind, the sight of the dead, and the sound of our own labored breathing. We had survived our first real test, but the necropolis was still ahead, and this was only the greeting party. We didn't linger. Borin made a quick assessment of our state. I had a few deep scratches on my armor and a head that still rang like a bell. Thurgar had a gash on his arm that Alera quickly sealed with a soft, golden glow and a murmured prayer. We were battered but whole. "Move," Borin ordered, his voice strained. "They know we're here now. The element of surprise is gone." We pressed on, leaving the carnage behind us, a grim tableau that would soon be covered by the indifferent snow. The psychic pressure in the air was stronger now, a palpable weight. It was no longer a vague sense of being watched. It was a focused, hateful glare. I could feel its tendrils searching for purchase in my mind, whispering of the futility of our mission, of the warmth of a grave, of the peace that came with surrender. I focused on the back of Borin's cloak, on the steady rhythm of his steps, using it as an anchor against the insidious tide. As we crested a low ridge, we finally saw it. The necropolis. It was a monstrous thing, a floating citadel of blackened stone and tortured metal, tethered to the ground by massive, pulsating chains of green energy. It hung in the air like a predator, blotting out the sky, a monument to death itself. A sickly green miasma coiled around its base, where the ground was a churned-up mess of mud and bone fragments. Figures shuffled in the gloom below, hundreds of them, an army of the dead, guarding their fortress. But it was what was happening at the center of the miasma that froze the blood in my veins. This was the source of the power we had felt, the heart of the darkness. It was a ritual site. A great, circular pit had been dug into the blighted earth, and at its center stood a colossal crystal, pulsing with the same vile green light as the chains holding the necropolis. Chained to monoliths surrounding the pit were figures. I could make out the sturdy plate of the Alliance patrol and the simple leather garments of the Farsher miners. They were alive, but only just. As we watched, a figure in dark, hooded robes, a necromancer, raised a staff, and a beam of crackling energy shot from the crystal, striking one of the captured soldiers. The man screamed, a horrifying, soul-tearing sound that was cut short as his spirit, a shimmering wisp of silver light, was ripped from his body and sucked into the glowing crystal. His body slumped, lifeless, and a moment later, its head snapped up, the eyes burning with the cold blue fire of the Scourge. It began to claw at its restraints, no longer a man, but another puppet for the Lich King. We were witnessing the very process of the Scourge's creation. They weren't just killing our people. They were harvesting them. Their courage, their memories, their very souls were being used as fuel, twisted and corrupted to power this unholy war machine. Every soul fed to the crystal made it pulse brighter, stronger. The sheer, industrial evil of it was staggering. This wasn't the hot-blooded rage of an orc or the cunning of a troll. This was a cold, calculated, and utterly soulless process of consumption. We were not just an enemy to them. We were a resource, a crop to be harvested. By the light, Ilera whispered, her face ashen. She took an involuntary step forward, her hand reaching for her mace. Boren put a hand on her arm, holding her back. "No," he said, his voice grim. "Look at their numbers. We'd be cut down before we got halfway." He was right. The ritual site was crawling with abominations, their cleavers glinting in the foul light, and skeletal guardsmen stood in disciplined ranks. A direct assault was suicide. The commander's orders were to disrupt. Thurger growled, his knuckles white on his axe haft. "That thing," he nodded towards the crystal, "is what we need to disrupt." Here was the choice, laid bare and brutal. We could try a desperate, likely fatal charge to free the prisoners, the few that were left. It was the honorable thing to do, the thing the stories and songs would demand of us. Or we could follow our orders. We could find a way to destroy that soul engine, to sever the link between the necropolis and its power source. It would mean abandoning those poor souls to their fate, writing them off as a cost of war. It was a choice between a noble death and a bitter, pragmatic victory. My heart screamed to charge, to make the necromancer pay for what he was doing, to grant those men the peace of a quick end. But my training and the cold logic of Boren's gaze told me otherwise. Boren made the decision. His face was a mask of stone, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. "We can't save them," he said, and the words fell like stones into the silence. "But we can stop this from happening to anyone else. We destroy the crystal. That is the mission." Ilera looked like he had struck her. "Sergeant, we can't just leave them. We can, and we will, priestess." Boren snapped, his voice harsher than I had ever heard it. "Their souls are already lost. Our duty is to the living, to the Alliance. A noble gesture that gets us all killed helps no one. We find another way in. We find the source of its power, and we cut it. That is final." Ilera looked away, her jaw tight, but she nodded. She was a soldier, too. She understood duty, even when it tasted like ash. We pulled back from the ridge, melting back into the shadows of the blighted forest. The screams of the harvested followed us, echoes that would haunt my sleep for years to come. Boren laid out the plan, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "The main force is focused on the ritual. The necropolis itself will have fewer guards. There must be a conduit, something feeding power from that crystal up into the floating fortress. If we can find it and overload it, we might be able to set off a chain reaction." It was a desperate gamble, based on a half-dozen assumptions about necromantic architecture. But it was better than no plan at all. "Thurger," Boren continued, "you're our battering ram. If we find a weak point, you make the hole. Ilera, you keep us alive and watch for magical wards. Kalen, you're with me. We find the path. We circled the compound, staying deep in the shadows. moving with a predator's stealth. The scale of the operation was immense. We saw lines of shambling corpses being herded towards the pit, their movements sluggish. They were the raw materials. We saw hulking abominations stitching together new horrors from spare parts in open-air workshops, the air thick with the smell of alchemy and rot. This was not just an army, it was an industry, and the whispers in my mind grew louder, more insistent. Look at this power. What can your little kingdom do against this? Your light is a flicker. Your steel is rust. Your courage is a joke. Surrender. Serve. Find purpose in the great machine. I gritted my teeth, focusing on the sound of my own breathing, on the cold leather of my glove, on anything real. We found what Boren was looking for on the northern side of the necropolis. One of the massive chains that anchored the fortress to the ground was different from the others. It didn't just pulse with green light. It actively funneled it upwards from a stone conduit set deep into the earth. The area was less heavily guarded, patrolled by only a handful of skeletal sentinels. There, Boren whispered, pointing. That's our way in. That conduit is drawing the power from the main crystal. If we can break it, he didn't need to finish. The backlash should be considerable, Ilera added, her voice carefully neutral. It could destroy this entire section of the fortress. Good, Thurger grunted. Our approach was swift and brutal. We moved from shadow to shadow, closing the distance to the skeletal guards. Boren gave the signal, a sharp, downward chop of his hand. We struck as one. I burst from behind a pile of rubble, my shield leading the way, and slammed into the first skeleton. The impact shattered its ribcage, sending bones scattering. I followed through with a sword thrust that took its skull from its spine. Thurger's axe whistled through the air, and two skeletons fell into pieces. Boren and Ilera dispatched the others with cold efficiency. It was over in seconds. The silence returned, deeper and more menacing than before. We had forced the door. Now we had to step inside. The conduit was housed in a low, stone building that seemed to be carved from a single piece of obsidian. There was no door, but Thurger fixed that. Stand back, he rumbled, and with a roar that was pure iron forge, he swung his axe. The rune-etched blade bit deep into the stone. Once, twice. On the third blow, the wall cracked and shattered inwards. A wave of foul energy washed over us, tasting of ozone and decay. We stepped through the breach into the heart of the machine. The noise inside was a deafening, low-frequency hum, the sound of immense power barely contained. A massive, glowing green cable of pure energy snaked up from the floor and disappeared into the ceiling, feeding the necropolis above. This was the artery. We had to sever it. The chamber was not unguarded. Standing before the energy conduit was a Death Knight. He was immense, clad in black, Serenite armor etched with glowing blue runes of frost and death. A horned helmet obscured his face, but 2 points of cold, intelligent light burned where his eyes should be. In his hands, he held a massive rune blade that seemed to drink the light from the room. He turned to face us, his movements slow and deliberate. The air grew instantly, painfully cold. "You have come far, mortals," a voice echoed, not from the night, but inside our own heads. It was a voice of 1,000 tortured souls, layered and rasping. "You have come far, only to die." Fear, cold and absolute, gripped me. This was not a mindless ghoul or a shambling skeleton. This was one of the Scourge's champions, a fallen hero remade into a vessel of the Lich King's will. All the whispered dread of Northrend was given form in this single, terrifying figure. "For Lord Darren," Boren yelled, the old battle cry a defiant shout against the encroaching despair. He charged, shield raised. The Death Knight didn't move. He simply raised his rune blade and brought it down. The clang of rune-forged serenite on Stormwind steel was a sound of finality. Boren was thrown back, his shield arm-numb, the metal of his shield glowing with a black frost. Thurger roared and charged from the side, his axe aimed at the knight's leg. The knight sidestepped with impossible grace for a creature his size and brought the pommel of his sword around, striking Thurger in the side of the head. The dwarf staggered, his helmet dented, but he shook it off, bellowing in fury. I moved to flank him, my sword feeling like a toothpick. I stabbed at a gap in his armor at the elbow, but my blade screeched off the enchanted plate as if it were solid diamond. The knight backhanded me with a gauntlet, and the world exploded in a flash of pain. I flew across the room and slammed into the far wall, my cuirass groaning in protest. My vision swam. "Fools," the voice in our head sneered. "Your pathetic light cannot touch me here." Ilera raised her hands, a brilliant sphere of holy energy forming between them. "His grasp is not absolute. The light endures," she cried, and she launched the sphere at the Death Knight. He raised a hand, and a wall of shimmering, unholy energy appeared before him, swallowing the holy spell hole. He laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Your light dies in the shadow of ice ground." He pointed his rune blade at her. "And so do you." A chain of spectral energy shot from the blade, wrapping around Ilera and lifting her from her feet, choking the life from her. "No!" Borin roared. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring his injured arm, and charged again, this time with a wild desperation. Thurger, his head bleeding, did the same. They hammered at the Death Knight, a storm of steel, but he was a mountain, turning their blows aside with casual ease. He was toying with us. He was showing us how hopeless it was. As Ilera struggled, her face turning blue, a terrible clarity came over me. We couldn't beat him, not in a straight fight, but our mission wasn't to beat him. It was to destroy the conduit. Lying on the floor, my head ringing, I saw it. The energy cable pulsing with unimaginable power, right behind the Death Knight. I pushed myself up, my body screaming in protest. "Thurger!" I yelled, my voice hoarse. "The conduit! Break the conduit!" Thurger's head snapped around. He saw what I saw. His eyes met mine for a fraction of a second, and in them, I saw an understanding. A dwarf is his oath. He turned his back on the Death Knight, a suicidal move, and with a final, earth-shaking bellow of 4 Cosmodon, he threw his entire body and soul into one last swing of his axe. The Death Knight, surprised by the change in tactics, turned to stop him, but Borin, seeing the play, threw himself at the knight's legs, a desperate, sacrificial tackle. Thurger's runed axe struck the energy conduit. The sound was not an explosion, but a deafening, soul-shattering crack, as if the universe itself had broken. A wave of pure, emerald energy erupted from the breach. It struck Thurger first, and the noble dwarf simply ceased to be. His armor, his axe, his very essence vaporized in a flash of green light. The wave expanded, hitting the Death Knight. The unholy magic that held him together was unmade. His armor melted, his rune blade dissolved into dust, and for a single, fleeting moment, I saw the face beneath the helm. It was human, his eyes wide with terror and release, before he too was annihilated. The wave washed over Borin, throwing him against the wall like a rag doll. It hit Ilera, shattering the spectral chains that held her, and she fell to the ground, unconscious. The wave hit me, and it was like being struck by a physical god. The pain was absolute, a fire that burned in every atom of my being. The roaring in my ears was the sound of creation being unmade. The necropolis above us groaned, a death rattle of stone and steel. The floor buckled, and the walls began to crumble. The power flow was broken. The chain reaction had begun. Through the haze of pain, I saw Borin stirring. He was alive. Ilera was breathing. I crawled towards them, dragging my shield, the instinct to survive overriding the agony. "Sergeant," I croaked. "We have to." Go. Borin pushed himself up, his face a mask of blood and grit. He looked at the empty space where Thurger had been, and a terrible, silent grief passed over his features. But there was no time. He nodded, scooped up the unconscious Ilera in a fireman's carry, and staggered towards the breach we had made in the wall. "Move! Kalen!" he yelled over the roar of the collapsing chamber. "That's an order." I stumbled after him, out into the sickly green twilight. The ground was shaking violently. The entire necropolis was listing, groaning as its anchor to the world was severed. Chunks of rock and metal began to rain down from above. The army of the dead below was in chaos, their puppet master's attention elsewhere. We ran. We ran without looking back, fueled by adrenaline and terror, the thunder of the falling fortress at our heels. We didn't stop until the forest swallowed us once more, until the sounds of destruction faded to a distant rumble. Borin finally collapsed to his knees, gently laying Alara down in the snow. I fell beside him, my body finally surrendering to the pain and exhaustion. For a long time, we just knelt there, gasping in the freezing air, the silence of the woods returning. I looked back. Over the treetops, a column of black smoke and green energy twisted into the sky, a funeral pyre for a fortress and for a friend. We had done it. We had disrupted the ritual. We had paid the price. Borin finally spoke, his voice raw. He saved us. The dwarf saved us all. He reached out and gripped my shoulder, his hand shaking. He held the line. There was nothing else to say. We tended to our wounds as best we could. Alara eventually stirred, groggy and disoriented, but alive. Her healing light was weak, but it was enough to mend the worst of Borin's injuries and ease the fire in my own veins. We took Thurger's shield clasp, the only thing we found in the wreckage that was recognizably his, a small, bronze emblem of a ram's head. We would take it back to Ironforge. It was all we could do. The journey back to Valiant's Keep was a long, grim procession. We were no longer hunters, but ghosts, haunted by the screams of the harvested and the memory of a friend's sacrifice. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like the mocking laughter of the Lich King. We moved in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I thought about the Death Knight's face in that final moment. The terror, the release. He had been a prisoner in his own body, a slave to the crown. That was the true horror of the Scourge. It didn't just kill you. It used you. It hollowed you out and wore your skin, your honor, your memory as a mask. It was an army of stolen souls, each one a tragedy, each one a weapon pointed at the heart of the living. When the walls of Valiant's Keep finally appeared on the horizon, I felt not relief, but a profound emptiness. We had won a victory, a small one in a war that seemed infinite, but it felt like a defeat. We had cut off one of the Lich King's fingers, but the hand remained, and it would grow another. Commander Halford met us at the gate. He took in our battered state, the absence of the dwarf, and his face settled into familiar, grim lines. Borin made his report, his voice devoid of all emotion, a simple recitation of facts, of objectives met, of casualties sustained. Sergeant Thurger Bronzebeard fell in the line of duty, sir. He died with honor, securing the mission's success. Halford listened, nodding slowly. His sacrifice will be remembered, he said, the formal words sounding hollow and inadequate. Report to the infirmary. You've earned your rest. Soldiers, rest did not come easily. The infirmary was warm and safe, but my mind was still in the cold, dark heart of the necropolis. I saw the soul crystal pulsing with stolen lives. I heard the screams. I saw Thurger turning to face the conduit, his face set with dwarven resolve. I understood now what we were truly fighting. We were not fighting an army of men or orcs who could be reasoned with, who could be broken, who valued their own lives. We were fighting a concept. We were fighting oblivion itself, an entity that saw all of life, all of history, all of love and courage, as nothing more than fuel for its endless, silent hunger. It sought to impose a perfect, final silence on the world, a kingdom of ice and bone where no one would ever have to feel pain or fear or hope again. I finally understood the Lich King's control. It was not just magic, not just necromancy. It was the promise of an end to struggle. It was the power of absolute despair. He whispered to the souls of the fallen, to the hearts of the living, that their fight was meaningless, that their sacrifices were for nothing, that the only logical choice in a cold, uncaring universe was to lay down their arms and join the inevitable peace of the grave. He offered order in place of chaos, purpose in place of doubt, and servitude in place of the terrible freedom of choice. And for so many beaten down by war and loss, it was a convincing argument. But Thurgar had shown me the flaw in that logic. A dwarf is his oath. A man is his word. The Lich King could take your life, your body, even your soul. But he could not take your choice, not unless you gave it to him. Thurgar had chosen. He had chosen to honor his oath, to protect his comrades, to swing his axe one last time, not for a king or a commander, but for the simple, honest truth of holding the line. That single act of defiance, of will, was a light brighter than any of Alara's spells. It was a fire the cold could not extinguish. It was the answer to the Lich King's whispered lies. In the days that followed, I went back to my duties. I stood my watch on the western battlement. The wind still blew from Iceground, carrying its scent of ancient dust and cold stone. The dread was still there, a constant companion. But something inside me had changed. The fear was still present, but it no longer had the same power over me. I had looked into the heart of the machine, and I had seen it break. I had seen a good man, a brave dwarf, spit in the face of oblivion and choose his own end. His sacrifice had purchased more than just our lives. It had purchased clarity. My courage was not a grand, heroic thing. It was small and stubborn, like a hardy mountain flower growing in a crack in the stone. It was the quiet resolve to do the morning's ritual, to strap on the armor one more time. It was the trust one placed in Borin's command, in Alara's faith, in the memory of Thurgar's sacrifice. It was the understanding that honor was not about winning, but about how you fought, about the choices you made when all choices seemed to lead to darkness. We fight because we must. We endure because we are all we have. We hold the line because it is the only thing worth doing. The war was far from over. I knew that. The great, silent king on his frozen throne was still watching, still waiting. But now we were watching back. Tomorrow, the wind will still blow from Iceground. And tomorrow, I will raise my shield again. I learned to trust my hunger before I trusted my courage. Courage was a memory, a phantom warmth from a life stolen by frost and steel. Hunger, though, was real. It was a constant, hollow ache in the pit of my soul, a chilling whisper that demanded suffering to be silenced. My service to the Ebon Blade was not a quest for redemption. It was a leash, a way to point that hunger at the deserving, lest it turn inward and consume the ashes of what I once was. My post was a lonely watchtower on the edge of the Dragonblight, a spire of black stone that clawed at a sky perpetually bruised with shades of gray and violet. Here, the only sound was the wind, a mournful dirge that scoured the ice and carried the ghosts of 1,000 battles. My days, if they could be called that in this land of endless twilight, were governed by a Spartan routine. I would rise from my cot, not from the call of sleep's end, but from a simple cessation of stillness. Sleep was a luxury for the living, a state I could no longer achieve. Instead, I entered a torpor, a silent state where memories, sharp and cruel as obsidian shards, would surface from the frozen depths of my mind. I saw a sun-drenched courtyard in Lordaeron, felt the weight of a different kind of armor, one polished to a silver gleam, not forged from the blood of tortured souls. I heard a woman's laugh, light and free, a sound that now felt like a physical blow. I would wake from these reveries with a phantom taste of bread and wine on my tongue, a cruel jest that only deepened the gnawing void within. The first ritual of the day was to tend to my armor. Serenite, the blood of an old god, they whispered, cooled and forged into an unbreakable cage. It was less a suit of protection and more a mobile tomb, each plate heavy with the echoes of despair. I would run a whetstone over the filigreed skulls and spikes, not to sharpen them, but to feel the vibration, the cold, dead resonance that matched my own. The metal was always cold, a deep, penetrating chill that seeped through my gauntlets and into my lifeless bones. It was a cold that the living could never comprehend. It was not the absence of heat, but a presence of its own, an active, malevolent force that clung to everything in this forsaken continent. My blade came next, Soul Reaper, a name I had not chosen, but one that had been branded upon it, and by extension, upon me. It was a monstrous thing of dark steel and shimmering, malevolent runes that pulsed with a faint, sickly green light. The runes were hungry, too. They drank the ambient misery from the air, and in battle, they drank life itself. Sharpening, it was a meditative act. The scrape of the runic forged stone against the edge was a rhythmic, predictable sound in a world of chaos. As I worked, I would feel the weapon's faint thrum of anticipation, a resonance that traveled up my arms and settled in my chest, a cold fire that mimicked a heartbeat. It was the closest I ever came to feeling alive. After the gear, there was the ghoul. I called him Patch, a crude name for a crude creature, stitched together from the parts of fallen soldiers. He was not a companion. He was a tool, a reservoir of necrotic energy I could draw upon, a hound I could unleash. He would shamble at the base of the tower, his jaw slack, his movements clumsy yet unnerving. He never made a sound beyond a low, wet gurgle. I would toss him a chunk of frozen mammoth meat, not out of kindness, but to maintain his form. He would devour it with a sickening series of snaps and tears, his vacant eyes fixed on nothing. Watching him, I often wondered how much of the man he was made from remained trapped within that grotesque shell. It was a question I did not want answered. The final part of my mourning was the scourging, not of the land, but of myself. The Lich King's will was broken, they said. We were free. But his voice was not the only chain that had bound us. There was the hunger, a constant, predatory need to inflict pain. To leave it untended was to let it fester, to let it drive you to madness and cruelty against the undeserving. So, I would descend to the crypts beneath the tower, where captured scourge abominations were chained to the walls. These were mindless things, animated only by the lingering magic of the fallen king. I would draw my blade, and I would cause them pain, not with the quick, clean efficiency of a kill, but with a slow, deliberate series of cuts and necrotic pulses. Each cry of agony from the creature, each sizzle of unholy energy, was a balm to the gnawing in my soul. It quieted the whispers. It sated the void for a time. It was a monstrous act, a necessary evil. This was the price of my control, the grim sacrament of my continued existence. My patrols were silent, lonely affairs. I would mount my death charger, Ruin, a skeletal steed whose eyes burned with the same cold, blue fire that flickered in my own. His hooves, shod in enchanted ice, made no sound on the packed snow. We would ride for hours, a solitary, ghostly figure moving through a dead landscape. The Dragonblight was a graveyard of giants. The colossal bones of dragons, ancient and vast, littered the plains, half buried in the snow like the ribs of forgotten gods. The air here was thick with history and sorrow. You could feel the echoes of the final, desperate moments of those magnificent creatures, a psychic residue of pain that clung to the very ice. It was a fitting place for one such as me. I patrolled the edges of the Path of the Titans, a massive, frozen road built by beings beyond mortal comprehension. Here, the wind howled with a particular ferocity, and the shadows seemed to writhe with unseen things. I was not looking for Scourge stragglers, not really. They were a nuisance, but no longer a coordinated threat. My task was to watch, to be a sentinel against anything that might seek to reclaim the Lich King's power, to harness the plague, or to disturb the restless dead. It was a vigil with no foreseeable end. I was a scarecrow in a field of bones, a warning made of dead flesh and dark magic. Sometimes, in the deep cold of the wastes, another memory would break through. Not of Lord Darren, but of this place. A memory from my time as a slave to the Scourge. I saw myself at the head of a deathless platoon, my blade glowing with a terrifying light, my commands echoing with the hollow authority of the Lich King's voice. I remembered the slaughter at Angrathar the Wrathgate, the sheer, unthinking ecstasy of destruction. I remembered the faces of the Alliance soldiers, their eyes wide with terror as I cut them down. I remembered the smell of their blood, hot and steaming in the frigid air. These were not phantom pains. They were stains on my soul that would never wash away. They were the truth of what I had become. On one such patrol, I found something that was not a memory. It was a corpse, half frozen in the snow near the base of a dragon's skull. This was not unusual, but the manner of its death was. The man was a human, a prospector by the looks of his gear. He was not torn apart by ghouls or pierced by a scourge blade. He was drained. His skin was gray and desiccated, clinging to his bones like old parchment. His eyes were wide, his mouth open in a silent scream, but there was not a single drop of blood on him or the snow around him. I knelt, my gauntlet resting on his frozen chest. A faint, unfamiliar necrotic signature lingered, twisted and amateurish, but undeniably present. It was not the clean, cold power of the Scourge. It was something else, something living. I followed the tracks. They were faint, covered by the recent snowfall, but my unliving eyes saw things the living could not. The subtle disturbance of energy, the lingering scent of fear and exertion. The trail led me away from the path of the Titans and toward a series of rocky, windswept hills that bordered the crystal song forest. It was a desolate region, avoided by the living and holding little interest for the Scourge. The tracks belonged to several individuals, shod in heavy boots, not the shambling gait of the undead. Mortals. They were clumsy, leaving behind discarded food rations and the occasional drop tool. They were trying to be discreet, but they were amateurs. As dusk settled, casting long, distorted shadows from the dragon bones, I saw a flicker of light in the distance. A campfire. I dismounted from Ruin, ordering him to wait with a silent command. The massive warhorse blended into the shadows, his cold fire eyes the only sign of his presence. I moved forward on foot, my plate armor making no sound, a privilege of the enchantments woven into it. I was a wraith of metal and memory, gliding over the snow. The camp was nestled in a small ravine, sheltered from the wind. There were 3 of them, mortals huddled around a fire, their faces gaunt and their eyes filled with a feverish light. They wore the ragged robes of scavengers, but their conversation was not of salvage. "The vessel is almost ready," one of them hissed, his voice a dry whisper. "The ritual requires more essence." The last one was barely enough. Another one, a woman with matted hair and a tattoo of a coiled serpent on her cheek, nodded. "The patrols are getting bolder." One of the Lich King's puppets was seen near the prospector's claim. "We must be quicker." The third man, larger and more brutish, simply grunted and poked the fire with a shard of bone. They were cultists, fools dabbling in powers they could not possibly comprehend. Necromancy was not a tool for the impatient or the greedy. It was a force of nature like a glacier or a plague, and it would consume them. I watched them for an hour, my body perfectly still, my breath a non-existent mist. They spoke of a master who had promised them power, eternal life in exchange for their service. They were preparing a ritual to reanimate a powerful corpse they had unearthed to create a servant of their own. Their ignorance was astounding. They thought they could control the forces of death, command the will of the grave. They were like children playing with a loaded crossbow. I could have ended them then and there. 3 quick strikes, 3 silent deaths. My blade hungered for it, but their talk of a master of a larger plan stayed my hand. This was not just a trio of deluded scavengers. It was a symptom of a larger disease. This was the moment the quiet routine was broken. This was the catalyst. It was not a grand summons from a High Lord, not a blaring war horn. It was the hushed, idiotic whispers of mortals meddling with my domain. Death was my charge now. It was the one thing I understood with perfect clarity. These people were defiling it, twisting it with their petty ambitions. They were an infection, and I was the cure. My vigil had found its purpose. I was no longer a scarecrow. I was a reaper, and a harvest was due. The summons came not from High Lord Mograine, but from the land itself. A desecration that demanded a response. Yet protocol was protocol. I returned to my tower, the cultist's words echoing in the silent chambers of my mind. I stood before the scrying basin, a pool of black water infused with shadows and echoes. Pouring a drop of my own stagnant blood into the water, I watched as the surface swirled and solidified, forming the grim, spectral visage of Darien Mograine, High Lord of the Ebon Blade. His face, eternally stern, regarded me from within the depths. There was no greeting, no preamble. Our kind had little use for such pleasantries. Report, Night Warden Kalen. His voice resonated, not through the air, but directly in my thoughts, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. I recounted what I had seen and heard. The Drain Prospector, the tracks, the cultists, their talk of a master and a ritual. I was concise, my words stripped of emotion, a simple recitation of facts. Mograine listened in silence, his spectral eyes unblinking. The Ebon Blade was stretched thin, our forces standing guard across this frozen hell and beyond, ensuring the Scourge remained a scattered, mindless threat. A new player on the board, especially one using necromancy, was a complication we could not afford. This master is unknown to us. Mograine's voice returned after a moment of consideration. The timing is suspicious. With the fall of the Lich King, a power vacuum was inevitable. Many would seek to fill it. His words confirmed my own thoughts. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the nature of magic, especially dark magic, is no different. Your vigil is now an investigation. Find this master. Uncover their purpose. Eradicate this cult. The command was absolute. There was no discussion of strategy, no offering of reinforcements. I was the instrument of the Ebon Blade in this sector. I was expected to be sufficient. It will be done, High Lord, I replied, the words feeling strange and formal in my own mind. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. Do not underestimate them, Kalen. The desperate are often the most dangerous. They wield power without discipline, and that makes them unpredictable. Show them the folly of their ambition. The connection severed, and his face dissolved back into the inky blackness of the scrying pool. The order was given. My oath, sworn in the shadow of Iceground itself, was invoked. We, the Knights of the Ebon Blade, were the jailers of the damned. We were the ones who would stand against the horrors we once served, ensuring no one else would ever wield that power again. Before I departed, I performed the ritual of the blade. In the heart of the tower's crypt, I knelt before a small, unadorned altar of black stone. I laid Soul Reaper upon it, its runes pulsing faintly in the gloom. I placed my hands over the hilt, closing my eyes, not to pray, but to commune. The light had long abandoned me, but power remained. I focused on the cold within me, the unholy energy that animated my dead limbs, and channeled it into the blade. The runes flared, from a dull viridian to a brilliant, terrifying emerald. A low hum filled the chamber, a sound of immense power barely held in check. I whispered the words of the oath, not to any god, but to the weapon itself. In death, we serve. In darkness, we find purpose. Let no soul defy the grave. Let no master rise from the ashes of the Scourge. The words were a promise. A vow to my blade, to my order, and to the remnants of the man I used to be. The blade grew cold, absorbing the energy, its hunger momentarily sated by my devotion. I sheathed it, the sound of steel on scabbard echoing like a final closing of a tomb door. My march began under the melancholic gaze of a fractured moon. The dragonblight was a different creature at night. The great bones of the dragons seemed to glow with a faint, phosphorescent light, and the wind carried whispers that were not just the product of a troubled mind. I did not ride ruin this time. A war horse, even a skeletal one, was too conspicuous. I moved on foot, a solitary shadow against the endless snow. My stride was tireless, a dead man's pace that could be maintained for days without rest. The cold was my ally, masking my presence, muffling my steps. I was a part of the landscape, another piece of the unending, frozen death that defined this land. I returned to the ravine where I had seen the cultists. The camp was abandoned. The fire was a circle of black ash, and all that remained were a few discarded scraps of leather and bone. They had moved on deeper into the hills. Their tracks were fresh, their haste evident in the chaotic mess they left behind. They were moving toward a specific location, a place of power they believed would be the crucible of their ascension. Following them was a simple matter. They were like frightened animals, leaving a trail of refuse and fear in their wake. Their desperation was a scent I could almost taste on the air. The path led me to the ruins of a small Tusker village, long since abandoned. The Scourge had swept through here during the war, and all that was left were the skeletal remains of their huts, the whalebone structures stark against the snow. But something was wrong. A new structure stood in the center of the ruins, a crude chapel built from driftwood, jagged stones, and frozen mud. A sickly green light emanated from the cracks in its walls, pulsing in time with a low, guttural chanting that vibrated through the ground. This was their sanctuary. This was where they would perform their ritual. I found a vantage point on a nearby ridge, concealing myself behind a snowdrift. There were more of them now, perhaps a dozen cultists, all clad in the same ragged robes. They patrolled the perimeter of the ruins, armed with crude weapons, sharpened bones, rusted mining picks. Their movements were jerky, their eyes wide with a mixture of zeal and paranoia. They were guarding something within that profane chapel. I watched them for hours, learning their patrol routes, their numbers, the rhythm of their guard changes. They were sloppy, undisciplined. Their faith was their only armor, and I intended to shatter it. My first clash was not with a man, but with their sentries. They had tamed several feral ghouls, wretched things that loped around the ruins, sniffing the air. They were less disciplined than the Scourge's minions, driven by raw hunger. One of them caught my scent, the faint, cloying odor of the grave that clung to me. It let out a piercing shriek and charged, its claws extended. I did not move from my hiding place. I simply extended a hand, and a chain of pure ice shot from my palm, wrapping around the creature's leg. With a flick of my wrist, I yanked it off its feet and dragged it silently into the snowdrift with me. Before it could make another sound, I plunged a dagger of solidified shadow into its skull. It convulsed once and then was still. A silent, efficient kill. The hunger stirred within me, pleased with the small offering. I dealt with the other ghoul hounds in a similar fashion, using the shadows and the terrain to my advantage, pulling them into the darkness one by one. I was a predator in my natural element. The cold, the dark, the silence, they were my allies. The living feared these things, but I was born of them. With their beasts dispatched, the mortal sentries were blind. I began to move among the ruins, a ghost of vengeance. I stalked the first patrol from behind, my steps perfectly synchronized with the howling wind. He never knew I was there. My hand, encased in frozen steel, clamped over his mouth while Soul Reaper slid between his ribs. I felt the jolt as his life was extinguished, a brief flicker of warmth that my blade greedily drank. I lowered his body gently to the ground, leaving it in the shadow of a whalebone arch. One by one, I dismantled their perimeter. I used strangulating shadows to pull a sentry from his post, a localized blizzard to mask my approach on another. Each kill was silent, brutal, and impersonal. These were not warriors. They were fools, and they were dying for their foolishness. There was no honor in this, no grand battle. It was an extermination. The cold logic of my purpose was absolute. They were a blight, and I was the blade that would purge it. As I moved closer to the makeshift chapel, the chanting grew louder, more frantic. They were beginning the ritual. Time was running out. I reached the entrance of the chapel, a crude door made of splintered planks. Two more cultists stood guard, their faces illuminated by the green light spilling from within. They held spears tipped with sharpened dragon bone, their knuckles white. They were terrified, not of an attacker, but of the power they were trying to invoke. I could feel the raw, chaotic energy pouring from the building, a storm of necrotic magic that prickled at my senses. They were channeling something far beyond their control. This had to end now. I did not use stealth this time. I stepped out of the shadows and into the faint light, my full, menacing height casting a long shadow before me. Soul Reaper was in my hand, its runes glowing with a predatory light. The two guards gasped, their eyes widening in terror. For a moment, they were frozen, paralyzed by the sight of a figure they had only heard of in hushed, fearful whispers. A death knight, a monster from their nightmares, made real. One of them found his voice, a high-pitched scream of alarm, as he thrust his spear at me. I swatted it aside with my gauntlet, the wooden shaft splintering on impact. I stepped forward, and with a single horizontal slash of my rune blade, I ended both their lives. Their bodies fell, and the chapel door swung inward with a groan. The true threat was inside. The interior of the chapel was a scene of pure madness. The air was thick with the stench of decay and burning, acrid incense. Green runes, crudely painted in what looked like blood, covered the walls, the floor, the ceiling. They pulsed with a sickening light, mirroring the frantic chanting of the 7 remaining cultists. They stood in a circle, their arms outstretched, their eyes rolled back in their heads. In the center of the circle, lying on a stone slab, was a corpse. But it was no ordinary corpse. It was the body of a Vrykul, one of the ancient half-giants who were the progenitors of humanity. It was immense, clad in rusted, archaic armor, a greatsword clutched in its dead hands. They were not just reanimating a body. They were trying to enslave a powerful, ancient spirit. At the head of the circle, leading the chant, stood a man in finer robes than the others. His face was hidden by a deep cowl, but his voice was clear, filled with a fanatical authority. This was the master. He was the source of the corruption. As I stepped into the room, the chanting faltered. The cultists turned, their ecstatic expressions turning to ones of horror. The master, however, did not flinch. He simply lowered his arms and turned to face me. "The ebon blade," he said, his voice surprisingly calm, almost academic. "I had anticipated your interference. You are a relic, a failed experiment. You seek to hoard death, to keep it locked away. I seek to share its gifts." He pulled back his cowl, and for the first time in my unlife, I felt something akin to shock. The face beneath the hood was one I knew. It was paler, thinner, etched with lines of cruelty and madness I did not recognize. But it was him, Lord Commander Valerius, a fellow knight of the Silver Hand, a man I had fought alongside in the campaigns against the orcs, a man I had believed died at the culling of Stratholme. I had seen him fall, overwhelmed by ghouls. His survival was impossible. Valerius? The name escaped my lips, a dry, cracked whisper. It felt alien on my tongue. He smiled, a twisted, joyless expression. "That name died in the flames of Stratholme, Kaelin. I am Ethelred now, the opener of the way. While you were raised as a mindless puppet, I was granted true vision. I saw the weakness of the light, the frailty of life. I hid among the dead. I learned from the Scourge's masters, not as a slave, but as a student. The Lich King was a flawed vessel, too concerned with conquest. The true power of necromancy is not in creating armies, but in perfecting life itself, in transcending it." He gestured to the Vrykul on the altar. "This is the first step, a vessel of ancient power bound to my will. With him, I will carve out a new kingdom, one where death is not an end, but a glorious beginning." This was the true threat. Not just a band of cultists, but a fallen paladin, a man who had twisted his knowledge and his faith into a grotesque new philosophy. He had seen the same horrors I had, but where I had been broken and enslaved, he had embraced the darkness willingly. He was not just a necromancer. He was an apostate, a heretic to the very concept of life and death that I was now sworn to protect. The revelation was a cold weight in my chest. This was not just a mission anymore. It was personal. Valerius, or Ethelred, represented a path I could have taken, a descent into madness I had narrowly avoided. "You are a fool, Valerius," I said, my voice finding its strength, cold and hard as the iron of my armor. "You have learned nothing. You trade one master for another, the Lich King for your own ambition. It will consume you all the same." He laughed, a short, sharp bark of a sound. "Look at you, Kaelin, the self-righteous corpse, chained to a new set of masters, pretending it is honor. You are a weapon that thinks it has a will of its own. I am a king." He raised his hand, and the cultists, their fear momentarily forgotten in their master's presence, drew their weapons. "No," Ethelred said, holding up a hand to stop them. "He is mine. an old debt to be settled. The choice was clear. There was no room for negotiation, no hope of redemption for him. He was a cancer that had taken root in the heart of this frozen land, and he had to be cut out. My duty to the ebon blade and the faint, lingering echoes of my old oaths as a paladin were in perfect, grim alignment. I had to protect the world from men like him. I had to protect the memory of the man he once was from a monster he had become. The mission was no longer about containment. It was about purification. I raised Soul Reaper, its green light casting my face in a ghastly glow. The silver hand is dead, Valerius, and I will send you to join it. Our vows were reaffirmed in that profane space, not as brothers in the light, but as enemies in the dark. He drew a wicked-looking, sacrificial dagger, its blade humming with stolen life force. The air crackled with power, the chaotic energy of the half-finished ritual swirling around us. Fear was a distant memory, replaced now by a cold, burning fire. It was the fire of purpose. The fear belonged to the cultists huddled against the walls, watching as two ghosts from a fallen kingdom prepared to wage their final, terrible war. The ordeal began not with a clash of steel, but with a surge of profane energy. Ethelred, the man who was once Valerius, thrust his ritual dagger towards the Vrykul on the altar. "Awaken, guardian! Serve your master!" he screamed, his voice cracking with exertion. The runes on the floor flared violently, and a torrent of green energy lanced from the cultists, converging on the ancient corpse. The Vrykul's massive chest shuddered. A low groan, like the grinding of tectonic plates, echoed through the chapel. Its eyes, vacant moments before, snapped open, burning with the same malevolent green light that filled the room. It was not a mindless undead. There was a flicker of ancient, hateful intelligence in its gaze. I could not allow the ritual to be completed. I charged forward, my heavy boots shaking the crude wooden floor. The cultists, seeing me move, broke their concentration and rushed to intercept me, their faces contorted in masks of fanaticism. They were clumsy, their attacks wild and uncoordinated. I moved through them like a reaper through wheat. A backhanded blow from my gauntlet crushed the throat of the first. Soul Reaper clove through the chest of a second, the runes on the blade flaring as they tasted life. A third tried to stab me with a sharpened bone, but the point shattered against my serenite plate. I grabbed him by the face, my grip like iron, and hurled him into two of his companions, sending them sprawling into the rune-covered walls where they screamed as the raw magic seared their flesh. Ethelred watched this carnage with a detached curiosity, as if observing a storm. "You are still a blunt instrument, Kalen," he sneered. All strength, no finesse. As I cut down the last of his followers, he completed his own incantation. He pointed his dagger at me, and a bolt of pure shadow energy, blacker than the spaces between the stars, shot towards me. I raised my blade, deflecting the bolt with a shower of green and black sparks. The impact shuddered up my arm, a numbing cold that was different from the chill of undeath. It was the cold of the void. While I was occupied, the Vrykul warrior finally pushed itself off the stone slab. It stood to its full, terrifying height, easily twice my own, its rusted armor groaning in protest. It raised its colossal greatsword, a weapon that was larger than I was tall, and fixed its glowing eyes on me. The battle became a deadly dance. The Vrykul was immensely strong, each swing of its sword powerful enough to shatter stone. I could not meet its blows head-on. I was forced to dodge and weave, my unnatural speed and agility my only defense. The massive blade would crash down where I had been a second before, sending splinters of wood and chunks of frozen earth flying. While I evaded the hulking corpse, Ethelred assailed me from a distance, launching bolts of necrotic energy, summoning grasping skeletal hands from the floor, and chanting debilitating curses that sought to slow my limbs and dull my mind. It was a battle on two fronts, against raw physical power and insidious, corrupting magic. I focused on the Vrykul first. It was the greater immediate threat. As it swung its sword in a wide, horizontal arc, I slid underneath the blow, the wind of its passage stirring my cloak. I came up inside its guard and drove Soul Reaper deep into the giant's leg. The rune blade bit through ancient mail and dead flesh, and the Vrykul roared, a sound of fury and pain that shook the very foundations of the chapel. It tried to bring its pommel down on my head, but I was already moving, pulling my blade free and rolling away. A bolt of shadow from Ethelred scorched the spot where my head had been. I was a rat in a cage with 2 starving cats. The cost of this fight was not measured in fatigue. I felt none, but in the steady drain on my power. Each parry, each burst of speed, each counterspell I had to instinctively weave to ward off Ethelred's curses drew upon my finite pool of runic energy. The runes on my blade began to dim, their hunger growing. I needed to feed them. I needed to inflict a telling blow. I saw my opening when the Vrykul, enraged by the wound in its leg, abandoned all caution and charged, its great sword raised for a killing blow. It was a foolish, predictable move. The warrior's spirit within the corpse was still a warrior, prone to rage. Instead of retreating, I stood my ground. I plunged my own blade, Soul Reaper, into the floorboards at my feet and focused my will. "Rise," I commanded, not with my voice, but with the full force of my necromantic power. The ground around the charging Vrykul erupted. The cultists I'd slain, their bodies still lying where they had fallen, were pulled back from the brink. Their limbs contorted, their spines snapped straight, and with empty sockets glowing with cold blue light, my own freshly made ghouls clawed their way to their feet. They were not strong, but they were a distraction. They threw themselves at the Vrykul's legs, clawing and biting, a swarm of vengeful corpses. The Vrykul bellowed in frustration, forced to stomp and kick at the ghouls swarming its feet. This was the moment I needed. With my newfound servants occupying the giant, I turned my attention to the true enemy. I drew Soul Reaper from the floor and charged at Ethelred. He was not a warrior. His surprise was evident on his face as I closed the distance in a few swift strides. He tried to conjure another spell, but he was too slow. I batted his dagger from his hand and slammed him against the chapel wall, my forearm pressed against his throat. "It's over, Valerius," I growled, the sound a low rasp of finality. He choked, a desperate, gurgling laugh escaping his lips. "You think you've won?" he gasped, his eyes wild with insane glee. "You only chose the manner of your own end." It was then I felt it. A searing, white-hot pain in my side. I looked down and saw the hilt of his sacrificial dagger protruding from a gap in my serenite plates. While I was focused on a Vrykul, he had summoned it back to his hand with a simple trick of telekinesis and plunged it into me as I charged. The blade was enchanted. It was not just steel that pierced me. It was concentrated, life-draining magic. It did not wound my body so much as my soul, a spiritual poison that began to unravel the very enchantments that held my unliving form together. My strength began to fail, the cold fire within me dimming. The assist came from an unexpected quarter. The Vrykul, having finally crushed the last of my makeshift ghouls, turned its attention back to me. It saw me falter, saw the dagger in my side, and it raised its great sword for the final, undeniable blow. I was too weak to move, the poison of Ethelred's dagger paralyzing me. This was it, a pathetic end at the hands of a madman and his puppet. But as the sword began its descent, one of my fallen ghouls, a creature I had raised only moments before and thought destroyed, gave one final, twitching lurch. It was not dead. With its last vestige of unholy animation, it reached up and latched its teeth onto the Vrykul's unarmored ankle. It was a meaningless attack, a flea biting a giant. But it was enough. The Vrykul's foot slipped on the icy floorboards, its balance thrown off for a fraction of a second. The greatsword, meant for my neck, went wide, burying itself deep in the wooden wall beside me. The Vrykul was overextended, its weapon stuck fast. In that instant, a flicker of my old strength returned, born of pure desperation. I ignored the screaming agony from the dagger in my side. I ignored Ethelred's triumphant laughter. I raised Soul Reaper with both hands, the runes flaring with a final, desperate burst of power, and I swung. The blade cut clean through the Vrykhol's thick neck. The giant's head, its green eyes wide with surprise, toppled from its shoulders and rolled across the floor with a heavy thud. The massive body stood for a moment, headless, before crashing to the ground, shaking the entire chapel. Ethelred's laughter died in his throat. His ultimate weapon was destroyed. He stared at the fallen giant, then at me, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. With a surge of adrenaline I did not know I still possessed, I ripped his dagger from my side, a guttural roar of pain tearing from my lungs. The wound did not bleed, but a foul, black smoke poured from it, the smoke of my own dying energies. I stumbled forward, holding Soul Reaper before me. "You have failed," I rasped. He backed away, his academic calm shattered, revealing the terrified man beneath. He fumbled for another spell, another trick, but his concentration was broken. I lunged, and my rune blade, hungry for vengeance, hungry for release, plunged deep into his chest. His eyes went wide, not with pain, but with a final profound understanding. "The void's so cold," he whispered, and then the light faded from his eyes, and the man who was once Valerius fell, truly and finally dead. The ordeal was over. The silence that descended upon the chapel was absolute. It was heavier and more profound than the quiet of the frozen wastes. It was the silence of a tomb, filled with the dead and the dying. The sickly green light from the runes on the walls flickered and died, their power source, Ethelred, extinguished. I stood there for a long time, leaning on my blade for support, the black smoke still coiling from the wound in my side. The room was a charnel house, littered with the bodies of the cultists, the headless corpse of the Vrykhol, and the still form of the man I once called brother. I was the last thing standing. Victory felt no different from defeat. It was just quiet. My first task was to consolidate. The wound from Ethelred's dagger was grievous. It was a spiritual injury, a severing of the bonds that held me together. I could feel my essence leaking away, a slow, cold drain that threatened to unravel me completely. I knelt, my movements stiff and agonizing, and placed my hand over the wound. I focused on the cold within, the core of my unholy power, and drew it towards the injury. I began to weave a seal, not of flesh, but of ice and shadow. Frost crystallized over the wound, forming a dark, glittering patch that staunched the flow of energy. It was a temporary measure, a crude patch that would hold until I could return to Akiris for proper repairs of the Runeforge. The pain did not subside, but the feeling of dissolution did. Next, I tended to the fallen, not with honor or ceremony, but with grim necessity. The bodies of the cultists could not be left to rot. In this land, a corpse was simply a vessel waiting for a new, malevolent occupant. One by one, I dragged them outside and piled them onto the remains of their blasphemous altar. I used a simple cantrip of frostfire, a cold, blue flame that consumed flesh and bone with equal efficiency, leaving nothing behind but scorched stone and a thin layer of gray ash that the wind quickly scattered. It was a clean, sanitary process, devoid of ritual. A problem had been solved. The Vrykhol was another matter. Its body was too large to burn easily, and its spirit, though now without a master, might still linger. I could not risk it being reanimated by some other scavenger of magic. I spent the next hour dismembering the corpse with my rune blade, a brutal, exhausting task in my weakened state. I separated limb from torso, scattering the pieces across the ruins, ensuring no single part of it could ever be used as a focus again. Its head I crushed under my boot, the ancient bone turning to powder. It was a desecration, but a necessary one. I was not here to preserve history. I was here to bury it. Finally, there was Valerius. I stood over his body for a long time, the cold wind whipping my cloak around me. Part of me, a small, forgotten part that still remembered the sun, wanted to give him a paladin's farewell, a prayer to the light, a cairn of stones. But he had forsaken that right. He was Ethelred now, a necromancer and a madman. The light would not answer a prayer from my lips anyway. Instead, I simply took his body and placed it upon the pyre with his followers. As the frost fire consumed his robes and his pale flesh, I felt nothing. No sorrow, no satisfaction, just a hollow emptiness. The past was ash, and it was my duty to scatter it to the winds. With the ground secured and the bodies disposed of, it was time to report. I could not travel back to the tower in my condition. I opened a death gate, a swirling vortex of shadow and frost, its energies taxing my already depleted reserves. The air shimmered, and a portal to Akiris, the ebb and hold, tore open before me. The familiar sight of our dark citadel, floating in the sky above the plague lands, was a grim comfort. I stepped through, the transition jarring and cold. I found myself in the command center before the strategic map of Azeroth. Lord Thorval, one of Mograin's lieutenants, was on duty. He was a massive orc, his skin the color of slate, his tusks capped in steel. He looked up from the map as I emerged, his red eyes taking in my state, the frost-sealed wound, the exhaustion that even the dead can feel. "Report," he grunted, his voice like rocks grinding together. I gave him the same account I had given Mograin, but with the grim conclusion. I told him of Valerius, of his identity, of his twisted philosophy, and of his end. I detailed the Vrykul, the ritual, and the cult's destruction. I left out the part about my own near demise, the moment of weakness. In the Ebonblade, strength was the only currency that mattered. Weakness was a liability. Thorval listened without interruption. When I finished, he simply nodded. "The threat is neutralized. The commander will be pleased. Your vigil was successful." He pointed a thick, clawed finger at my side. "Go to the Runeforge. Have a soul binder tend to that. You're no use to us, broken." It was the closest thing to concern I could expect to receive, and I accepted it as such. There was no praise, no commendation. The mission was complete. That was all that mattered. The unknown remained. We still did not know if Valerius was truly the head of this snake, or if he answered to an even greater, unseen master. But for now, this particular infection was purged. I turned and walked towards the lower levels of Akiris, each step in agony, the silence of the hold a welcome shroud after the screams and chaos of the battle. The roar was over, and the quiet had returned. At the Runeforge, a goblin soulbinder with scorched eyebrows and a morbid fascination with Death Knight physiology tended to my wound. He muttered about unstable matrices and necrotic decay, his tools probing and stitching the spiritual tear in my being with threads of solidified shadow. The process was excruciating, a cold fire that felt like my very soul was being unmade and rewoven. But it worked. The leak of energy was sealed. The wound closed over not with a scar of flesh, but with a permanent tracery of faint, dark runes that would forever mark the spot where Valerius's ambition had struck me. I was whole again, if such a word could ever apply to me. In the days that followed, as I recovered my strength in the cold halls of Akiris, I had time to reflect. The confrontation with Valerius had taught me something vital. It was not enough to simply be a jailer of the Scourge. The legacy of the Lich King was not just an army of the dead. It was an idea of power through death, of order through domination. It was a seductive philosophy, and Valerius would not be the last fool to fall for its charms. The living, in their fear and greed, were just as dangerous as any mindless ghoul. They would always seek to harness what they did not understand, and in doing so, they would threaten to unleash it upon the world once more. I learned something about myself as well. In that final moment, facing the Vrykul, I had not felt the cold, calculated logic of the Ebonblade. I had felt a flash of something older, the desperate instinct of a warrior to survive, the protective rage of a knight defending his charge, even if that charge was only his own cursed existence. The ghoul that had saved me, the one I had raised without a thought and considered utterly disposable, had shown more loyalty in its final twitch than Valerius had shown in his entire life. It was a humbling, disturbing thought. Perhaps there was more to my power than just cold domination. Perhaps there was a flicker of the old bonds, of loyalty and sacrifice, still buried deep beneath the ice. My understanding of the enemy had sharpened. They were not always monsters of rotting flesh and bone. Sometimes they wore familiar faces. They spoke with familiar voices. They were born not of plague, but of despair, ambition, and a twisting of faith. Valerius had been a good man once. I remembered him being the first to charge, the last to retreat. I remembered him sharing his rations with a hungry squire. The horror was not that he had become a monster, but that a hero had. It was a reminder of the thin line we all walk, and how easily it could be crossed. It solidified my resolve. My purpose was not just to fight monsters, but to ensure that no more were ever created. I returned to my lonely watchtower in the Dragonlight. It was unchanged. The wind still howled its mournful song. The great bones still littered the snow-swept plains. The sky was still a canvas of bruised purples and grays. My routine resumed. I tinted my armor. I sharpened my blade. I fed the ghoul. But something within me had shifted. The hollow ache was still there. The hunger still whispered. But now it was joined by something else. A clarity, a grim, unyielding sense of purpose that was wholly my own, not one given to me by Mograine or the Lich King before him. My oath was renewed, not in a grand ceremony, but in the silent stillness of my own dead heart. I was a warden, a sentinel at the edge of the world, watching over the greatest graveyard imaginable. My vow was to the memory of the fallen, both the innocent and the corrupted. I would stand guard over the ashes of the past to protect the future of a world I could no longer truly be a part of. I would be the monster that hunts other monsters. I would be the cold that drives out the dark. Tomorrow, I march again. I looked out from the highest window of my tower, across the endless, frozen expanse of the Dragonblight. My blade, Soul Reaper, was strapped to my back, its runes pulsing with a faint, steady light. It was a cold and miserable existence, a life of endless winter and eternal vigilance. But it was my existence, and I would endure. For Lord Darren, for the fallen, for the ones who still had the warmth of life to lose. A whisper to the fallen, to Valerius, to the nameless prospector, and to the countless others. Rest now. I will keep the watch. I'll learn to trust my shield before I ever trusted my courage. The steel is simple. It holds or it breaks. Courage is a more complicated thing, a flickering candle in the soul that you pray the wind does not find. I was a footman in the Argent Crusade, stationed at the edge of the world's deepest scar, and my shield was a round of scarred comfort against the encroaching dark. Our post was a place called Hearthglen, a bastion of stubborn light against the suffocating gloom of the western plaguelands, a name that still tasted like ash on the tongue. My days began not with a rooster's crow, but with the doleful, distant tolling of a chapel bell. It was a sound less of hope and more of grim persistence. Before the sun had even troubled the bruised purple of the horizon, I was awake on my cot, the straw mattress rustling like dry bones. The air in the barracks was always cold, thick with the scent of old leather, sweat, and the faint, metallic tang of blade oil. I would lie there for a moment, listening to the breathing of the 20 other men in the long, stone room. Some slept soundly, but most, like me, were restless, their sleep haunted by the land we had sworn to cleanse. The first ritual of my day was simple. I would reach for the worn leather straps of my shield, propped against the wall beside me. My fingers would trace the deep gouges in its face, each a memory of a ghoul's claw, a necromancer's bolt, a bandit's desperate axe. It was a map of my survival. The morning routine was a testament to discipline over despair. We would file out into the pre-dawn chill of the courtyard, our breath pluming in the air. The flagstones were perpetually damp, slick with a dew that felt unnaturally cold. Sergeant Boros would be there waiting for us, a mountain of man whose face was a roadmap of forgotten campaigns. He never shouted. He never needed to. His presence was enough, a silent demand for perfection. Armor first, he would grumble, his voice like stones grinding together. The light protects the soul, but steel protects the body. See to the steel first. We would spend the first hour in a meticulous ritual of maintenance, checking every strap, polishing every plate, using whetstones on our blades until the edges were sharp enough to shave with. It was a meditative act, a way of focusing the mind on the tangible, the controllable. You could not control the blight, but you could control the keenness of your sword. Hearthglen itself was a paradox. Within its high stone walls, there was a semblance of life. The chapel stood tall, its stained glass windows depicting saints and heroes of a bygone age, a defiant splash of color against the unrelenting gray of the sky. Priests and paladins walked the grounds, their polished armor gleaming, their litanies a constant, humming undercurrent to the clang of the forge and the shouts of training squires. There was a garden, tended by a quiet priestess named Alara, where she coaxed stubborn, pale vegetables from the reluctant soil. It was a small patch of green in a world of brown and gray, and we all felt a fierce, unspoken need to protect it. But just beyond the walls, the world was dying. The great trees of the old Tirisful glades were skeletal claws reaching for a sky that offered no comfort. The ground was a tapestry of sickly greens and purples, and the air carried a perpetual scent of decay, a sweet, cloying odor that clung to the back of your throat. I had been born in a village not far from here, a place that no longer existed on any map. It had a name once, but that name was buried under rubble and restless spirits. I fought in these lands not for a king or a grand cause, but for a memory. The memory of sunlight on a wheat field, the sound of my mother's laughter, the solid feel of my father's hand. These were the things the Scourge had consumed, and I was here to reclaim the echoes. My faith in the light was not like Alara's, a brilliant, unwavering sun. Mine was a guttering torch I carried into a deep cavern, a small thing that I had to shield with my own hands to keep it from being extinguished by the suffocating darkness and the chilling drafts of doubt. It was a practical faith born of necessity. I had seen the light turn a ghoul to ash. I had felt its warmth mend a wound that should have been fatal. It was real. It was a tool, a weapon like my sword and shield. And I would use it. Our squad was a microcosm of the crusade itself. There was Sergeant Boros, the old bull who had fought since the Second War. His faith was in his men and the strength of a well-formed shield wall. Alara, the priestess, was young, her eyes still holding a fire that had been banked to embers in most of us. She saw the good in reclaiming this land, the holy duty. For her, every inch of cleansed soil was a prayer answered. Then there was Gunnar, a dwarf from Ironforge, a volunteer who had come north seeking, as he put it, a proper bloody mess to clean up. His faith was in black powder and good dwarven steel. He was a rifleman, his long gun a constant companion, and his wry, grim humor was often the only thing that kept our spirits from sinking into the blighted mud. And there was me, Kalen, the footman, the anchor of the line, the one whose job it was to simply stand and endure. We trained relentlessly. The courtyard would ring with the clash of steel as we practiced formations. The shield wall was our catechism. We learned to lock our shields so tightly that not even a whisper of wind could pass between them. We learned to trust the man on our left and the man on our right more than we trusted our own eyes. Boros would walk the line, his heavy mace tapping against a shield that was too high, a stance that was too wide. The wall is one entity, he would say, his voice a low rumble. It breathes together. It stands together. It breaks together. Do not be the crack that lets the darkness in. We would drill until our arms ached and our bodies screamed, until the movements were instinct, until the shield felt like an extension of my own bone and sinew. In the evenings, if we were not on watch, we would gather in the mess hall. The food was bland, stew, hard bread, watery ale, but it was hot and it was shared. It was in these moments that the facade of the stoic soldier would crack. Men would speak quietly of homes they had not seen in years, of families they prayed were still safe. Gunnar would tell loud, boisterous stories of mountain halls and dragons, his voice a welcome thunder in the quiet hall. Alara would sometimes read from the holy texts, her clear voice a balm on weary souls. I rarely spoke of my past. It was a locked room inside me, and I did not have the key nor the desire to find it. I would sit and listen, cleaning my gear, my hands finding comfort in the familiar tasks. The kinship was unspoken, but deeply felt. We were survivors, bound together by a shared duty and a shared proximity to death. We were a family forged in the crucible of a blighted world. Life settled into a rhythm of vigilance and waiting. We patrolled the lands immediately surrounding Hearthglen, clearing out the shambling, mindless undead that wandered too close. These were skirmishes, not battles. Disjointed ghouls, clumsy skeletons, the occasional bloated abomination that required concentrated effort to bring down. It was grim work, but it was necessary. It was like weeding a garden, Alara once said, pulling up the corruption so that something new could one day grow. I found the analogy difficult. The weeds we pulled were once people. Farmers, merchants, children from Lordaeron. Every time I drove my sword through a rotted chest, I would see a flicker of a face, a remnant of a life stolen. Boros had taught me to shut that part of my mind down. You are not killing a person, lad, he had told me once, after a particularly hard patrol. You are granting them peace. You are ending their torment. See it as a mercy, and your arm will not falter, but there were nights when sleep would not come. I would climb the battlements and look out over the plague lands. Under the cold, distant light of the twin moons, the land looked deceptively peaceful, a rolling sea of silvered hills and skeletal forests. But I knew what was out there. I could feel it, a malevolent intelligence, a patient evil that was not content with what it had already taken. The Scourge was not a mindless horde. It was a weapon, and though its master had been defeated in Northrend, fragments of it will remain, festering in the dark places of the world. Sometimes I thought I could hear whispers on the wind, faint and insidious, promises of power, of an end to pain. It was the song of the land itself, a dirge of corruption. On those nights, I would grip the cold stone of the wall, recite the tenets of the light, and pray for the dawn. The dawn always came. That was the one promise the world still kept. This routine, this grim cycle of duty and watchfulness was our life. It was a hard life, a life lived on a knife's edge, but it was ours. We held the line. We were the flickering candle against an infinite night. We endured, and we waited. We waited for the day when our duty would call us out, beyond the familiar, weed-choked fields and into the deeper, darker heart of the plague lands, where the true secrets, the true terrors, lay sleeping, waiting for someone to be foolish enough to wake them. We all knew that day would come. It was not a matter of if, but when. We just prayed we would be ready when it did. The bell tolled. Another day began, and I picked up my shield, its weight a familiar burden, a familiar comfort. The steel was simple. It would hold, or it would break. And so would I. The summons came on a morning thick with a fog that clung to the ground like a shroud. It was an unnatural mist, cold and carrying the faint, foul scent of an open grave. It deadened sound, making the usual morning clangor of the keep feel distant and muffled. We were in the midst of our morning drills when the horn blew from the watchtower, a single, urgent blast that was not part of any scheduled call. It was the signal for an emergency. We froze, hands tightening on our weapons. Sergeant Boros's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the walls. "Form up," he barked, the command cutting through the fog. "For the main gate. Move." There was no panic, only a swift, disciplined rush to our posts. We had trained for this moment 1,000 times. At the gate, a scene of grim urgency was unfolding. A lone rider had collapsed just inside the portcullis, his horse lathered and trembling. He was one of ours, a scout from the Argent Vanguard. He was barely alive. His leathers were torn, and a festering, black wound marred his side, pulsing with a sickly green light. Alara was there in an instant, her hands glowing with the light's holy energy as she knelt beside him. But even from a distance, I could see it was too late. The blight was too deep, the corruption too absolute. The man was delirious, his words a desperate, broken torrent. Scalomance, a new master, They're not just raising the dead, they're building them. He coughed a spray of black ichor, and his eyes rolled back. Alara's light flickered and died as the life left him. She stayed there for a moment, head bowed, a silent prayer for a soul already lost. High Lord Fordring himself came down from the keep's command center. His presence commanded an immediate, reverent silence. He looked at the fallen scout, his face a mask of grim resolve. He conferred quietly with the captain, who then turned to Boros. Orders were exchanged in low, clipped tones. I watched Boros's face. It remained impassive, but I saw a subtle tightening around his jaw, a hardening in his eyes. He had been given a task, and it was not a simple one. He turned to face our squad, which had gathered nearby. "Gear up," he said, his voice low but carrying to every one of us. "Full combat load. Rations for 3 days. We have our orders." He looked at each of us in turn. At me, at Gunnar, who was checking the firing mechanism of his rifle, and at Alara, who was rising from the side of the dead scout, her face pale, but her expression firm. "We're going east, toward Corrin's Crossing." The name fell like a stone in the quiet courtyard. Corrin's Crossing, a ruined town that had been a contested zone for years, a place where Scourge remnants and zealous Scarlet Crusaders fought their endless, pointless battles. It was a place sane people avoided. The scouts' mention of Scholomance was even more chilling. The vile academy of necromancy was thought to be largely contained, its leadership shattered. If a new master had risen there, if they were experimenting with the blight, as the scout had gasped, it was a threat that could not be ignored. We were to be the eyes and ears of the crusade, a reconnaissance mission into the heart of the rot. Find out what this new threat was, assess its strength, and report back. Do not engage unless necessary. The last part was always said, and always the first to be disregarded when steel was drawn. There was no grand speech, no call to glory. Duty was a quieter, heavier thing. We gathered our supplies in a practiced silence. I checked the straps on my shield for the 3rd time, packed extra whetstones, and secured my bedroll. Alara filled her satchel with blessed bandages and vials of holy water, her movements precise and deliberate. Gunnar, ever the pragmatist, packed extra ammunition and a block of hard, pungent cheese he claimed could survive any apocalypse. He caught my eye and gave a grim, tight-lipped smile. "Well, lad," he grunted, patting the stock of his rifle. "At least it's not another patrol chasing mindless ghouls." A proper bit of trouble, for once. His attempt at levity was a thin cloak over the tension we all felt. We knew what this was. This was not weeding the garden. This was marching into the heart of the blight. Before we left, we stood before the chapel entrance. It was a tradition for squads heading into the deep wilds. Alara stepped forward and spoke a short, simple blessing. "May the light be your shield and your sword. May it guide your feet on the shadowed path and bring you safely home to this hearth." She touched the Argent Crusade insignia on each of our pauldrons, a silver hand against a golden sun. When her fingers touched my armor, I felt a faint, fleeting warmth spread through the cold steel, a small comfort against the chill that had settled deep in my bones. It was a warmth that felt like a memory of hope, a fragile thing in this land of despair. Boros gave the final command. "Let's move." He did not look back. None of us did. We marched out of the main gate, the heavy iron portcullis groaning shut behind us, a sound of finality. The fog was beginning to thin, but the world it revealed was no less grim. The path eastward was little more than a suggestion, a track of churned mud and broken stones that wound its way through skeletal trees and over hills the color of old bruises. The oppressive silence of the plague lands descended upon us, broken only by the rhythmic tramp of our boots, the jingle of our armor, and the whistling of a wind that felt like a dead man's sigh. The summons had come. Our quiet days of waiting were over. We were now in the grasp of the land itself, and it did not welcome us. We were a tiny flicker of light and steel, marching deliberately into an ocean of shadows, and all we had to rely on was our training, our faith, and the person marching beside us. The march was a descent. With every league we put between ourselves and Hearthglen, the the land grew more twisted, more openly hostile. The sickly greens and purples of the blight deepened into angry, gangrenous hues. The skeletal trees were no longer just bare. They were warped into agonized shapes, their branches like twisted limbs reaching for a sky permanently veiled in a sickly, gray haze. The air grew thick, heavy with the stench of ancient decay and something else, something sharper and more chemical, like ozone and spoiled alchemy. The silence became profound. There were no birds, no insects, not even the rustle of a rat in the undergrowth. It was the silence of a world holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. We moved in a tight diamond formation. Boros at the point, his heavy tower shield a bulwark against the path ahead. Gunnar and I were on the flanks, our heads on a constant swivel, scanning the dead ridges and hollows. Alara was in the center, protected, her mace in one hand, a holy symbol clutched in the other. Her presence was a quiet focus, a pool of calm in the tense watchfulness that surrounded her. We communicated with hand signals Boros had drilled into us, a silent language of war. A closed fist for halt, a pointed finger for a point of interest, a flat palm for caution. Every gesture was precise, economical. Words were a liability here. Sound traveled too far. Our first night in the wilds was a lesson in vigilance. We made a cold camp in the lee of a collapsed watchtower, a relic of Lord Darren's fall. We dared not risk a fire. The light would be a beacon for every foul thing in this cursed land. We ate our rations of dried meat and hardtack in the encroaching gloom, the food tasting like dust in our mouths. First watch is Kalen and me, Boros stated, his voice a low growl that was swallowed by the oppressive quiet. Gunnar, Alara, get what rest you can. We move at first light. There was no argument. His orders were absolute. While the others settled into their bedrolls, I took my position beside Boros, my back against the cold, crumbling stone of the tower. My shield was planted firmly in the dirt before me, my sword resting across my lap. The darkness in the Plague Lands was not merely an absence of light. It felt substantial. It pressed in, heavy and cloying. The twin moons were obscured by the thick cloud cover, offering only a faint, spectral luminescence that made the twisted landscape seem even more monstrous. Shapes moved in the periphery of my vision, tricks of the light and an overstrained imagination. But the sounds were real. The faint, wet scraping of something dragging itself through the blighted soil. The distant, mournful howl of a plague rot, a wolf twisted by the blight into a skeletal horror. A soft, insidious whispering that seemed to come from all directions at once. A sibilant murmur just at the edge of hearing. I gripped my sword hilt, my knuckles white. Easy, lad, Boros murmured, not even looking at me. The land plays tricks on a mind. Trust your eyes, not your ears. And trust your steel above all. It was a long watch. To keep my mind focused, I went through the litany of protection in my head, the words a familiar anchor in the sea of encroaching dread. I thought of my training, of the shield wall, of the feel of locked shields with my brothers in arms. Courage, I reminded myself, was not the absence of fear. It was the refusal to let fear control you. It was the simple, stubborn act of standing your ground when every instinct screamed at you to run. Boros was a rock beside me, utterly still, his breathing slow and even. He seemed less a man and more a part of the ancient stone we leaned against, immovable and tireless. He had been doing this for more years than I had been alive. This land had not broken him, and I drew strength from his stoic presence. The first clash came shortly after dawn. The gray light had just begun to seep into the world when Gunnar, now on watch, gave a low whistle. Boros and I were instantly awake, weapons in hand. Gunnar pointed with the barrel of his rifle toward a shallow ravine ahead of us. Movement, he whispered. 5 of them. Ghouls. And they've got a scent. We crept to the edge of the rise and looked down. He was right. 5 hunched, emaciated figures were lurching through the ravine, their movements jerky and unnatural. They were sniffing the air, their heads turning from side to side. They had caught our trail. There was no going around them without losing precious time. Standard engagement. Boros ordered, his voice crisp. No noise if we can help it. Alara, stay back. Bless our weapons. Gunnar, take the one on the far right. Kalen, with me. Alara whispered a prayer, and I felt that familiar, faint warmth infuse the steel of my sword. Gunnar rested his rifle on a rock, taking careful aim. Boros and I drew our blades and began to move down the slope, using the terrain for cover. We were a well-oiled machine. The plan was simple. Gunnar's shot would be the signal. He would eliminate the most distant target, and Boros and I would close the gap and deal with the remaining ghouls before they could raise an alarm. The crack of Gunnar's rifle shattered the morning silence. It was a clean shot. The ghoul on the far right collapsed without a sound, a neat hole drilled through its skull. In that same instant, Boros and I charged. The remaining 4 ghouls spun around, their faces masks of feral hunger, their jaws unhinging to let out a guttural shriek. But we were too fast. Boros crashed into the first 2 like a battering ram, his shield sending one flying and his mace crushing the skull of the other in a single, brutal blow. I took the one on the left. It lunged, its filth-caked claws reaching for my face. I caught them on my shield, the impact jarring my arm to the shoulder. I shoved forward, creating an opening, and drove my sword through its chest. The blade grated on bone. It thrashed, its dead eyes staring at me with a vacant malice. I kicked it off my sword and turned to face the last one. This one was larger, more cunning. It dodged Boros's swing and scrambled toward Alara, who was standing her ground, her mace held ready. There was no time to think. I threw myself in its path, my shield up. It slammed into me, the force of it driving me back a step. Its stench was overwhelming, a wave of rot and grave dirt. It snapped at me, its yellowed teeth clicking inches from my face. I held my ground, my feet planted, my shield taking the brunt of its furious assault. This was what I was trained for, to endure, to hold the line. For a moment, we were locked in a grim stalemate. Then Boros was there. His mace came down in a devastating arc, and the creature's head imploded. It collapsed into a heap of twitching limbs and foulness. Silence returned, broken only by our ragged breaths. The clash had lasted less than a minute. It was brutal, efficient, and ugly. Alara moved forward and spoke a quiet prayer over the fallen creatures, a rite of cleansing to ensure they would not rise again. Good work, Boros grunted, wiping his mace on the blighted grass. But they're getting smarter. They were patrolling. Organized, he looked toward the east, his eyes narrowed. The scout was right. Something is stirring out here. Something new. We cleaned our weapons, the acrid scent of undead ichor clinging to the steel. We had adapted. We had survived the first test. But this was just the beginning. Khorne's crossing was still a day's march away, and the feeling of being watched, of walking into a carefully laid trap, was stronger than ever. The stakes had been set, and the cost of failure was a price too terrible to contemplate. As we drew closer to Khorne's crossing, the evidence of a more organized evil became undeniable. We found crude warning signs staked into the ground, rotting heads of wildlife impaled on sharpened poles, their empty eye sockets seeming to watch us pass. We found tracks, not just the shuffling drag of mindless undead, but the clear, booted footprints of humanoids, moving in disciplined patrols. And we found the bodies. Argent Crusaders, their tabards torn and stained, left where they fell. They had not been devoured, as was the ghouls' way. They had been killed with weapons, with dark magic, their bodies left as a clear message. We were not welcome here. This territory had a new master. We crested a low, windswept ridge and finally laid eyes on the town. Khorne's crossing was a skeleton picked clean. The shells of burnt-out houses stood like broken teeth against the gray sky. The town square was a rubble-strewn wasteland, and the spire of its desecrated chapel was tilted at a precarious angle, a broken finger pointing accusingly at the heavens. But it was not abandoned. Figures moved among the ruins. Robed cultists patrolled the perimeter, their hoods pulled low. Abominations, larger and more grotesquely stitched together than any I'd seen before, stood guard at the main road, their massive cleavers resting on their shoulders. A sickly green haze, thicker than the surrounding blight, clung to the center of the town, pulsing with a faint, malevolent light. It emanated from the old town hall, a large, stone building that seemed to be the heart of their operation. Gods above, Gunnar breathed, lowering his spyglass. It's a fortress, he was right. This was no simple Scourge infestation. This was an army, an organized, intelligent force. Boros scanned the scene, his face grim. The scout was right, he said, his voice a low rumble. They're not just raising the dead. Look, he pointed toward a makeshift stockade near the town hall. Inside, I could see cages, and in the cages, there were people. Living people. Some wore the tattered remnants of Argent Crusade uniforms. They were prisoners. As we watched, 2 cultists dragged a man from a cage and hauled him toward the glowing town hall. He was struggling, screaming, but his cries were cut short as the heavy doors slammed shut behind him. A cold dread, far deeper and sharper than the simple fear of combat, settled in my stomach. They were taking prisoners. For what? The scout's dying words echoed in my mind. They're not just raising the dead, they're building them. The horrifying truth of it hit me with the force of a physical blow. They were using living subjects for their vile experiments. They were creating new horrors from the bodies of our own comrades. This was not just a military threat. It was a desecration of the highest order. The mission had changed. This was no longer just reconnaissance. We could not leave our people to that fate. We have to get them out, Ilera whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of horror and righteous fury. Her knuckles were white where she gripped her holy symbol. Boros did not answer immediately. He was the commander, and the weight of the decision rested on his shoulders. Our orders were clear: observe and report. Engaging a force of this size was suicide for a squad of 4. But leaving those prisoners, it was unthinkable. It violated every oath we had ever sworn. I watched his face, saw the conflict in his eyes. He was weighing our lives against our duty, our chances of survival against our honor. It was an impossible choice. We can't fight our way in, Gunnar stated flatly, ever the pragmatist. They'd cut us to pieces before we got halfway to the square. He was right. A frontal assault was out of the question. We needed a plan, something clever, something desperate. We retreated from the ridge and found cover in a cluster of petrified trees to discuss our options. The air was thick with tension. For the first time, I felt a crack in our unity. The sheer scale of the enemy, the horror of what they were doing, it was threatening to overwhelm us. There must be another way in, I said, my voice hoarse. An old sewer entrance. A collapsed wall. My mind was racing, trying to find a solution, any solution other than walking away. Boros pulled out a worn, leather-bound map of the region, its edges frayed from years of use. He smoothed it out on a flat rock. Corn's Crossing was built on the river. He mused, tracing a line with his finger. There's a culvert system that drains into the Blackwood Creek. It's a long shot, but it might get us inside the perimeter without being seen. It was a sliver of hope, but a sliver was all we had. The revelation of their cruelty had sharpened our purpose, but it had also laid bare the terrible choice before us. We had 2 objectives, both vital. The first was to free the prisoners, to deny the cultists their raw materials, and save our comrades from a fate worse than death. The second, equally critical, was to find out what was happening inside that town hall. What new form of blight were they creating? What abominations were they designing? That information was vital to the crusade. If we could get inside, find their research, their plans, and destroy them, we could cripple their operation. But we were only 4 people. We could not do both. We would have to choose. We split up, Boros said finally, his voice heavy with the gravity of the decision. It's the only way. My heart sank. Every tenet of military doctrine screamed against it. Splitting a small force in hostile territory was a death sentence. Sergeant, no elara pretestif. We stand together. The shield wall can't be in 2 places at once. Priestess. Boros cut her off, his tone sharp but not unkind. This is the hard math of our duty. He looked at us, his eyes lingering on each face. Ilera, You and I will create a diversion at the west gate and try to free the prisoners. Your light will be their best chance. Gunnar, Kalen, you take the culvert. Get into that town hall. Find whatever research you can. Burn it. Burn it all to the ground. Then we meet back at the ridge. If one team isn't there by sunrise, the other gets the hell out and reports back to Hearthglen. No heroics. No exceptions. Is that understood? We all nodded, a grim, silent assent. The choice had been made. We would try to do both. It was a fool's gambit, a desperate throw of the dice. But it was the only choice our honor would allow. We reaffirmed our vows, not with words, but with a shared look of grim understanding. We checked our weapons one last time. I met Gunnar's eyes. He gave me a curt, determined nod. "Watch your back in there, lad," he said, "and try not to get us killed before I get a chance to." His wry humor felt like a tether to the world we had left behind, a world where choices were not so stark, so final. We were no longer just soldiers on a mission. We were instruments of a desperate hope, and the fear I felt was now eclipsed by a cold, burning fire of resolve. We would not let this desecration stand, whatever the cost. The culvert was as foul as I had imagined. It was a narrow, brick-lined tunnel, slick with algae and a century of filth. The stench was overpowering, a thick, gagging mixture of sewage and the pervasive rot of the plaguelands. We moved in a crouch, the dark, fetid water sloshing around our boots. The only light was a small, enchanted stone Gunnar carried, which cast a weak, flickering glow that seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive darkness just a few feet ahead. Every splash, every dislodged stone, sounded like a thunderclap in the confined space. My heart pounded against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the slow, tense progress. Gunnar was ahead of me, his rifle held high to keep it out of the muck. He moved with a surprising stealth for a dwarf, his feet finding purchase on the slippery bricks. My shield felt impossibly cumbersome in the narrow tunnel, constantly scraping against the walls. More than once, I had to unstrap it and carry it, leaving me feeling exposed and vulnerable. We were blind down here, relying on the old map and Boros's hope that this path was still viable. The fear was a living thing, a cold presence at my back, whispering of cave-ins, of creatures lurking in the dark water, of this tunnel becoming our tomb. I focused on the back of Gunnar's cloak, on the steady rhythm of his breathing, and forced myself to keep moving. After what felt like an eternity, we found it, a rusted iron grate set into the ceiling of the tunnel. It was directly below where Boros's map had marked the town hall. This was our entry point. Gunnar passed me the light stone and, with a grunt of effort, reached up and tested the grate. It was heavy, but it shifted. Hope, sharp and painful, lanced through me. Working together, we managed to push it aside, the screech of protesting metal setting my teeth on edge. We froze, listening, but there was no sound of alarm from above. Gunnar gave me a leg up, and I cautiously poked my head through the opening. We were in a cellar, a storage room beneath the town hall. It was filled with crates, barrels, and the thick, cloying smell of alchemical reagents. It was blessedly empty. I pulled myself up, then helped haul Gunnar and our gear into the relative safety of the room. The town hall was a place of nightmares. The ground floor was a grotesque laboratory. Long wooden tables were covered with arcane instruments, beakers bubbling with viscous, glowing liquids, and scrolls covered in spidery, necromantic script. But it was the subjects on the tables that made my stomach turn. Body parts, some fresh, some stitched together from multiple sources, lay in grisly arrangements. A disembodied arm twitched, connected by copper wires to a crackling arcane conductor. In a large glass tank, a heart pulsed in a green fluid, a monstrous, unholy beat. This was where they were building their new horrors. This was the heart of the madness. "By my ancestor's beard," Gunnar whispered, his face pale beneath his beard. "This is foul work. We had to move quickly." We had no idea when Boros and Alara would start their diversion. Our goal was the research, the plans. We began a frantic search of the laboratory, checking scrolls, ledgers, and diagrams. Much of it was incomprehensible to me, complex magical formulae and anatomical charts that were a perversion of any healer's text. But the intent was clear. They were trying to create a more resilient, more intelligent form of undead. Not just mindless slaves, but soldiers. They were experimenting with infusing the bodies with fell energy, with shadow magic, trying to create abominations that were faster, stronger, and capable of tactical thought. It was the next evolution of the Scourge, born in this cursed place. Suddenly, from outside, we heard a shout, followed by the unmistakable, brilliant flash of holy magic. A wave of concussive force rattled the very foundations of the building. Alara. The diversion had begun. Almost immediately, alarm bells began to ring throughout the town. We heard the heavy tread of booted feet on the floor above us, the guttural roars of abominations being roused. Time was up. We have to burn it all. I hissed, my voice tight with urgency. Gunnar nodded, pulling a small satchel from his belt. It was filled with oil-soaked rags and a flint and steel. Start piling up the scrolls, he ordered, everything that looks important. On the biggest table, we worked with a desperate, frantic energy, gathering the vile research. I grabbed a stack of scrolls detailing the construction of a new type of flesh golem, its pages filled with chillingly precise instructions. As I threw them onto the growing pyre, a sound from the adjoining room caught my attention. A low moan. It was not the sound of an undead creature. It was a sound of human misery. My hand froze. There was someone else down here. Against my better judgment, against the screaming urgency of our mission, I moved toward the sound. I pushed open a heavy wooden door and peered into the darkness beyond. It was a holding cell, and chained to the wall was a single prisoner, an Argent Crusader, his body racked with the signs of early-stage blight infection. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. "Help me," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. They were going to put me on the table next. My choice was instantaneous and absolute. We were not leaving him. "Gunnar," I called out. "We've got one. Get these chains." The dwarf cursed under his breath, but was at my side in a second. His rifle was slung over his back as he examined the heavy, iron manacles. "These are solid," he grunted. "Can't break him. Quick." He looked from the prisoner to the growing sounds of commotion upstairs. The shouts were getting closer. They knew someone was inside. In that moment, the ordeal began. The door to the cellar crashed open at the top of the stairs, and a hulking shape filled the doorway. It was one of the cult's guards, a brutish warrior in dark plate armor, his face obscured by a skull-faced helmet. He let out a roar and charged down the stairs, a massive two-handed axe in his grip. There was no room to maneuver. Gunnar shoved me forward. "Hold him! I'll get the prisoner," he yelled, turning his attention back to the chains, his smith hammer now in his hand as he began to strike at the lock. I planted my feet, raised my shield, and met the warrior's charge. The impact was like being hit by a battering ram. The axe crashed against my shield with a deafening clang, and the force of it sent a shuddering shockwave up my arm and through my entire body. My teeth rattled in my skull. I was driven back a step, my boots skidding on the stone floor. The warrior was immensely strong, his blows falling like hammer strikes, relentless and brutal. I could do nothing but defend, turning my body, angling my shield, absorbing the punishment. Sparks flew as his axe scraped down the face of my shield, leaving another deep scar in the steel. Behind me, I could hear Gunnar's frantic hammering on the chains, punctuated by the prisoner's pained grunts. I was losing ground. The warrior was too strong, his assault too ferocious. He was forcing me back, away from Gunnar and the prisoner, trying to isolate me. A blow caught the edge of my shield, knocking it aside for a fraction of a second. It was the opening he needed. The axe swung in a low, vicious arc, aimed at my legs. I tried to leap back, but I was too slow. The blade bit deep into my thigh. A searing, white-hot pain exploded in my leg. I cried out, stumbling, my leg threatening to buckle beneath me. The warrior loomed over me, his axe raised for the killing blow. This is it, I thought. This is where it ends. Then, a deafening roar filled the small room. It was not the sound of the warrior or the abominations upstairs. It was the sound of Gunnar's rifle, fired at point-blank range. The warrior's helmeted head snapped back, a spray of dark fluid erupting from the back of his skull. He stood there for a second, a statue of dark iron, and then crashed to the floor like a felled tree. I sagged against the wall, my hand clamped over the gushing wound in my leg, my breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. "The chains are off," Gunnar shouted, helping the weakened prisoner to his feet. "But we've got more company." He was right. 2 more cultists were starting down the stairs, their swords drawn. "The fire!" I yelled, pushing myself off the wall, my legs screaming in protest. "Light the fire." Gunnar understood. He supported the rescued crusader with one arm, and with the other, he tossed the oil-soaked bundle of rags onto the pile of research. He struck his flint and steel, and with a whoosh, the pile erupted in flames. Acrid smoke immediately began to fill the room. The fire caught quickly, the dry parchment and volatile chemicals creating a raging inferno. We had done it. The research was destroyed. Now we just had to get out alive. The smoke was our only cover. The 2 cultists at the top of the stairs were hesitating, unwilling to charge into the blinding, choking cloud. "The culvert. Now," Gunnar ordered. We plunged back into the smoke. I half-limped, half-crawled toward the hole in the floor, the pain in my leg a nauseating, pulsing agony. Gunnar and the prisoner were right behind me. We dropped back into the filth-filled tunnel, the cool, foul water a shock against my wounded leg. Above us, the fire raged, the sound of it mingling with the enraged shouts of the cultists. We had struck a blow. We had hurt them, but the cost was already mounting. Gunnar had used his one shot. I was grievously wounded, and we had no idea what fate had befallen Boros and Alara. We had only completed half the mission, and it had already almost destroyed us. We scrambled back into the darkness of the tunnel, the light of our success a raging fire at our backs, and the uncertainty of our escape a suffocating darkness ahead. The retreat through the culvert was a nightmare journey through my own personal hell. Every movement sent a fresh wave of agony shooting up my leg. The cold, filthy water did nothing to numb the pain. It only seemed to make the wound throb with a deeper, more profound ache. The rescued crusader, whose name I learned was Theron, was weak, barely able to stand. Gunnar, a dwarf of incredible fortitude, practically carried the both of us, his own breath coming in ragged pants, his face set in a grim mask of determination. The smoke from the fire had followed us into the tunnel, and soon we were choking on it, our eyes streaming. We were a sorry trio, wounded and exhausted, stumbling through the dark. When we finally emerged back into the gray light of the Plague Lands, I collapsed onto the blighted soil, gasping for air that did not taste of smoke and filth. The sounds of the battle we had left behind were still audible. Shouts, the clang of steel, the unholy roar of abominations. But there was another sound, too. The sound of Alara's voice, raised not in a prayer of healing, but in a battle cry, a raw, powerful shout of defiance that ended in a blinding flash of light from the direction of the town's west gate. Even from this distance, we felt the tremor in the ground. She had unleashed something powerful, a desperate, final gambit. Then silence. A heavy, dreadful silence that was worse than the noise of battle. "We have to go," Gunnar said, his voice strained. He was already tending to my leg, tearing a strip of cloth from his cloak to make a crude bandage. "We stick to the plan. Rendezvous at the ridge." He hauled me to my feet, and I leaned on him, my arms slung over his broad shoulders. Theron, though weak, found a reserve of strength and managed to walk on his own. We began the slow, agonizing trek back to the rendezvous point. Every step was a fresh torment. My vision swam, and the world seemed to tilt and sway. The only thing that kept me moving was the thought of the plan, of Boros's final order. Meet at the ridge. Sunrise. We reached the ridge as the first, weak rays of the sun began to pierce the gloom. The sky to the east was the color of a fresh bruise. We scanned the landscape, our eyes desperately searching for any sign of Boros and Alara. The town of Corrin's Crossing was a hive of activity, but it was the activity of an angered nest, not a victorious army. Smoke still billowed from the town hall. Cultists were searching the perimeter, their movements angry and agitated. Our fire had done its work, but there was no sign of our comrades. We waited. The sun climbed higher, a pale, indifferent disk in the sky. The silence from our friends was absolute. Sunrise came and went. Boros and Alara did not appear. The hard math of our duty, Boros had called it. The finality of his order settled upon us with the weight of a burial shroud. If one team isn't there by sunrise, the other gets the hell out. No heroics, no exceptions. It was the hardest order I had ever had to follow. To turn our backs, to leave them behind, felt like a betrayal. But it was what Boros would have wanted. It was what he had commanded. The information we had, the prisoner we had saved, that had to make it back to Hearthglen. Their sacrifice had to mean something. Gunnar looked at me, his face etched with a grief so profound it seemed to crack his stony dwarven features. "It's time, lad," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We have to go." I could only nod, a lump of ice in my throat. We took one last look at the cursed town, a silent farewell to the sergeant who had been our rock and the priestess who had been our light. The cost of our small victory was immense. We had lost half of our squad, our family. We had lost our leader. We had paid in blood and sorrow for a handful of burnt papers and one rescued life. I do not know if it was a fair trade. I only knew that we had to honor it. The journey back to Hearthglen was a long, harrowing blur of pain and fear. My wound festered, and a fever began to set in. I drifted in and out of consciousness, leaning heavily on Gunnar, who seemed to be powered by sheer, stubborn will. Theron, despite his own weakness, helped as much as he could, taking turns scouting ahead. We were hunted. The cultists were enraged, and their patrols scoured the countryside for us. More than once, we had to hide in ditches or behind stands of dead trees, holding our breath as a patrol passed mere yards away. We moved mostly at night, the darkness our only ally. During the day, we would find what shelter we could and rest, though sleep was a luxury filled with nightmares. In my feverish state, I saw Boros's face, heard his voice telling me to stand firm, to hold the line. I saw Alara, her hands glowing with a light that was being consumed by shadows. I felt the crushing weight of my failure. I had held my line in the cellar, but what of the larger battle? What good was my shield if it could not protect my friends? These thoughts were a poison, weakening me as much as the blight in my wound. It was Gunnar who kept me going. He cleaned my wound with what little fresh water we had, forced me to eat, and spoke to me in a low, gruff voice whenever my spirit began to falter. "You're not die on me, lad," he would grumble. "Boros didn't die, so you could give up in a ditch. We're getting back. We're going to tell them what he did, what they both did. That's the duty now." His words were a bucket of cold water, shocking me back to the present, back to the grim task at hand. He was right. Our survival was now the memorial. We finally saw the walls of Hearthglen on the third day. The sight of the Argent Crusade's banners, snapping in the wind, was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The last few hundred yards were the hardest. I stumbled, my strength completely gone. Gunnar and Theron had to half carry, half drag me to the gate. The guards, seeing our state, raised the alarm, and the portcullis was raised. We staggered inside, and I collapsed onto the familiar, solid flagstones of the courtyard. Healers rushed to my side. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me completely was the face of High Lord Fordring, looking down at us, his expression a mixture of relief, sorrow, and grim understanding. We were back. We had survived. But the roar of the battle was over, and now came the quiet, crushing weight of its aftermath. I awoke in the infirmary. The blessed scent of clean linen and healing herbs replaced the stench of death and decay that had been my world for the past week. My leg was bandaged, the throbbing pain reduced to a dull, persistent ache. The fever had broken. Alara's teachings had not been in vain. The healers here were skilled, their use of the light a gentle, restorative miracle. I lay there for a long time, simply breathing, feeling the solidness of the cot beneath me, listening to the muted sounds of the keep. It was a world away from the horrors of Corrin's Crossing. It was a world Boros and Alara would never see again. Gunnar was sitting in a chair by my bedside. He was cleaning his rifle, the familiar, methodical clicks and scrapes a comforting sound. He looked up as I stirred. "About time you woke up, sleepyhead," he said, his attempt at a jest falling flat. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his face seemed to have aged a decade. "Theron is recovering. The healers say he'll make a full recovery. They purged the blight from him." He paused, his hands stilling on the rifle. "They're calling us heroes," he said the word with a quiet, bitter contempt. "We gave our report to the High Lord. All of it. The labs, the research, the prisoners. The loss of Boros and Alara. We did not speak of what happened at the West Gate. We did not need to. We both knew. They had sold their lives to buy us time. Boros, the immovable shield, holding a choke point against impossible odds. Alara, the gentle priestess, unleashing a final, desperate act of holy fire to scatter the enemy and cover our escape. They had done their duty to the very end. Their sacrifice was the reason we were alive, the reason the Crusade now knew the truth of the threat brewing in the East. They were heroes. We were just the ones who had to live with it. Later that day, I was summoned to give my own account to the High Lord. Supported by a crutch, I made my way to the command center. Tyrion Fordring stood before a large map of the Plague Lands, his gaze fixed on the spot marked Corrin's Crossing. He listened patiently as I recounted our story, my voice hoarse and unsteady. I told him everything: the culvert, the laboratory, the warrior in the cellar, Gunnar's shot, the fire. When I spoke of Boros's final order, of our retreat at sunrise, my voice broke. I had followed my orders, but I felt like a deserter. Fordring placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. His eyes, wise and weary, met mine. "You did not desert them, son," he said, his voice resonating with a quiet authority. "You honored them. You completed the mission. Because of you and your squad, we now know what we are facing. We can prepare. We can fight back." Their lives were not spent in vain. They were spent for a purpose. Never forget that. His words were a balm, not erasing the grief, but giving it shape, giving it meaning. He told me that Theron's testimony had corroborated everything. The cult, calling themselves the Risen Flesh, was indeed led by a powerful necromancer from the fallen house of Barov, a former instructor at Scholomance who sought to perfect the work of the Lich King. Our actions had been a major setback to his plans. We consolidated what we had won. The information was disseminated. New patrols were organized, new defenses planned. The Crusade was mobilizing, preparing for a full-scale assault on Corrin's Crossing. The knowledge we had brought back, paid for so dearly, was being turned into a weapon. We had held our ground, tended our wounded, and honored our fallen. A small, private service was held for Boros and Alara in the chapel. It was not a grand affair. It was a quiet gathering of those who had known them. Gunnar and I stood side by side. I did not weep. The grief was a hard, cold knot in my chest, too deep for tears. I simply stood there, my hand resting on the pommel of my sword, and remembered. I remembered Boros's gruff wisdom, the safety of standing beside him in the shield wall. I remembered Alara's unwavering faith, the warmth of her light in the oppressive dark. The report was made, the losses accounted for, but so much remained unknown. How many more labs like that one were hidden in the Plague Lands? How far had the Risen Flesh spread their influence? Our small victory felt like holding back a single wave in an overwhelming tide. We had won a battle, but the war, the endless, grinding war for the soul of this land, raged on. The quiet after the storm was not peaceful. It was a tense, watchful silence, the silence of a soldier waiting for the next call to arms. It was the silence of knowing that the enemy was still out there, rebuilding, plotting, and waiting. The ordeal had changed me. The Plague Lands were no longer just a cursed landscape I was tasked to cleanse. They were a personal battleground, a place where I had lost part of myself. I had learned a hard lesson in that cellar, a lesson written in steel and blood. I understood now that honor was not found in glorious charges or triumphant victories. It was found in the grim choices, in the sacrifices made in the dark, in the quiet determination to keep fighting when all hope seems lost. It was found in the courage to follow an order that breaks your heart, because the mission, the lives of others, depended on it. My faith, once a flickering candle, had been tested in a gale. It was not extinguished. Instead, the flame now burned with a different quality. Not the bright, hopeful fire of Alara's faith, but a cold, hard, blue flame of pure resolve. A few days later, my leg had healed enough for me to walk without the crutch. I went to the training yard, the place where my journey had, in a way, truly begun. I picked up my shield. It was battered, the deep gash from the warrior's axe a fresh, ugly wound on its face. But it had not broken. It had held, just as Boros had taught me. I looked out over the walls, toward the east, where the gray haze still hung over the horizon. The crusade was gathering its strength. Soon, they would march on Khorne's crossing. They would need every soldier, every shield. My duty was not over. It had just been given a new, sharper focus. I thought of Boros and Alara, and a quiet oath formed in my heart, a promise to their memory. I would not let their sacrifice be for nothing. I would stand in the shield wall. I would hold the line. I would be the steel that protected the light. I hefted the shield, its weight familiar and right. The fear was still there, a cold companion in the back of my mind, but it no longer held any power over me. I had faced a true threat. I had paid the cost, and I had endured. My resolve was forged anew in the fires of that hellish laboratory. What was preserved was a chance for the living to fight back, to reclaim what was lost. What was lost was irreplaceable. Good soldiers, dear friends. The price of our survival, of our small victory, was a debt that could only be repaid in continued service. My oath was renewed, no longer just a pledge to a distant cause, but a personal vow, sealed in the memory of the fallen. I would see this through to the end. I would see Lordaeron cleansed, or I would die on its blighted soil trying. Tomorrow, I march again.